The caricaturist Laurent Salle. The interpretation channels and other useful information. So, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Mr. Matthias Gruden, who will moderate the session. Time for Facts. A big round of applause, please. Thank you, Matthias.
Good morning, everybody. Welcome to this first act of the 2025 World Forum for Democracy. It is time for facts. Now, someone could think that we are organizing this session even before the official opening as a sort of stand-in act, just a warming session before the real forum starts, but I think there may be some of it, something in that. But the most important reason why we are starting this forum and every forum in the last couple of years with the session Time for Facts is much more important. It is simply because any conversation about democracy should start with facts. Maria Ressa, the journalist from Philippines who won the Nobel Peace Prize, said that without facts there is no truth, without truth there is no trust, without trust there's no shared reality, and without shared reality there is no democracy. Now, not that at the expense that we would be insisting on facts at the expense of opinions, because you also, of course, also need your opinions in democracy. And this year we have a novelty. You will on your desks find the QR codes, and these QR codes, if you use them in an appropriate way, which I'm sure you are familiar with, will lead you to a short questionnaire on a set of questions about democracy. I would really like all to invite you to use that and respond to that questionnaire. It's a part of our exercise initiative, the process preparation of the new Democratic Pact for Europe. I will have perhaps later on more opportunity to explain you what this major initiative, of which this forum is a very important part, is all about. But right now I would just invite you to use that opportunity and answer the questionnaire. So, time for facts, and in order to look at the facts, where we are with our democracies, what are the problems, what are the issues, perhaps start looking at identifying where the solutions may lie. We have an extremely competent and prominent panel with us this morning. And that's not an opinion, that's a fact. Starting with Helmut Anheier from the Hertie School of Government in Berlin. Please, applause. We have been working with Dr. Anheier and the Hertie School of Government for some time already on some indicators for culture and democracy, a very important issue and often underlooked issue. We are looking forward to hear about this and other things from Dr. Anheier later. We have Staffan Lindberg, Director of VDEM from Sweden. We have Quinn McHugh, Executive Director of Article 19. And Laura Silver, Associate Director of Global Research of Pew Research Center, Washington, D.C. So, dear panelists, warmly welcome. Thank you very much for being here with us today to kick off this World Forum for Democracy. I will not lose any more of this precious time, and I will turn to you, starting with Dr. Anheier. You have the floor. What are the facts?
Thank you. I use that microphone. Good. Yes. Good. Thank you so much for your kind words. Good morning. It's a pleasure being here. I will share with you. That works. Facts that emerge from a work that we've been doing for a number of years on the question of how culture and democracy relate. And it's been said that culture is one of the most complicated words in the English language, and I think it's a complicated word in any language. And we can have a long conversation about what is culture and what is not culture. Culture is somehow in everything, but it's also sometimes quite concrete. You could have a similar debate about democracy. So when the Council of Europe a decade ago decided to have more of a fact base on how culture and democracy relate, they had particular aspects in mind that you see on the slide behind me. So they wanted to know more about how can we support culture, and how does culture then impact democracy, and how does democracy impact culture. Right? And that was a formidable challenge for us, given that there are so many different conceptualization floating around of what is culture and what is democracy. And we developed, after a number of sessions also with members of the council, a model of how we could possibly measure not only what we mean by culture and what we mean by democracy, but in particular the relationship. Now here you have to be very, very careful, because we're not saying that culture causes democracy or that democracy causes culture. It's a very subtle back and forth. And you see some of those aspects play out when I share the results for you. So we set out to have a parallel measurement, as you can see in that pie, right? So we looked at cultural participation, but also at political participation. Right? We looked at freedom and equality within culture and freedom and equality within the larger political system. We looked at what is it in cultural policy that is being supported by the government in power, and what is it in terms of policy that wants to strengthen democracy. So strengthening cultural policy measures and strengthening political policy measures. And that led us then to a fairly complex indicator model with over 150 sub-indicators, and that's exactly what I will spare you at the moment, and that goes straight to the results that we last updated last year. And there are various ways in which you can display that, and I opted for straightforward illustrations of the relationship between culture and democracy. So it's a simple cross-tabulation where we rank the countries in how democratic they are, right, using all these various indicators, and how they rank on the various cultural indicators. We kind of summed it up, and then the member states were grouped. There are some countries that are around the mean, right? There's a group of countries that is a bit above the mean, and a group of countries that is below the mean. And we did that both for democracy and for culture. Now, the good news is here that most of the countries fall along the major diagonal, right? And these are the countries in green, right? And overall, the correlation, this is not a causation, the correlation is 0.6, which is, by social science standard, at that level of aggregation, actually quite good, right? So you can say there is a relationship between culture and democracy. Or you can turn it around and say there's one between democracy and culture, right? But you also see that we have some countries that are really not ranked very high in terms of democracy and the our cultural measurement, right? I'm not saying there's no culture in these countries. No, I'm saying compared to the other countries, there is less of a support of culture policy, or there's less cultural participation, right? And there are countries where we have that rank highly on democracy, but they also rank highly on our cultural indicators, right? And some countries in the middle, and we have a few countries that are off the diagonal, right? And these are interesting cases to look at. Now, overall, this is the macro picture, right? You see something in red and you see something in green, right? Green are the results from 10 years ago, right? And what is red is what we have in 2024. Now, you might say, hey, there isn't much change, but these changes are very often quite gradual. They're slow change, because it's sometimes slow changing indicators. But we're not doing better across the board in 24 than we did in 15. And in particular, when you look at the political measures that are more on the left, upper left, we see that the red line is below the green line, right? Now, that picture you can look at in a different way by looking at the sub-indicators. And here we see a similar picture, particularly on the political level. Do we see a slight erosion, right? This is not dramatic, but it indicates a certain concern. And that concern is more relevant in some countries than in others. Therefore, it is useful to look at how the countries that are top-ranked, right, compare when we look at 2017 and 2024. These are the countries that rank high in terms of cultural indicators and high in terms of democracy indicators, right? Some countries there is movement, but overall there is more stability, and that's good news, right? So the consolidated democracies of Europe tend to be also the countries where you have a certain consolidated cultural policy and cultural life, for example, in terms of cultural participation, right? So stability there. A lot of more movement happens, and you see but also how they are scattered, right? And the distance they have traveled. And when we look at the middle-ranking countries, right? And here it is mixed. Some countries are doing better, others are doing worse. So it is probably wrong to conclude that overall there is a deterioration of democracy in Europe and culture. It is very often country-specific and also group-specific, right? So from a policy perspective, the countries you want to watch are less in the upper echelon, but they are in the middle. And what's even more concerning is the countries in the bottom, because they have generally not improved very much, and some countries have really gone the other way, right? And I will come back to that in the conclusion in a few minutes. You can also look at particular countries. This is I think that should be the Czech Republic, right? Yeah, Czechia. And you see, at the country level, there is much, much more change and much, much more movement. And as we have argued with our friends here at the Council of Europe, the policy utility of an indicator system like that is probably less at the macro level for all member states, but at the level of the member state, right? And here you see that there are quite a lot of differences within Chechnya, in this case the Czech Republic. This is, I think, Estonia, and you see in Estonia we have a country that has shown quite a lot of improvement, right? And in fact, you can see that the orange line, that is the current line, and the blue line is where Estonia was in 2017, and the grayish line is the average for the country. So Estonia is, you might say, a success story when you look at the relationship in culture and democracy. Now, from a policy perspective, you would then say, well, what is it that the Estonians do right? What can we learn from Estonia? And that's the cross-country learning. This is Belgium, and you see that Belgium is a bit of a mixed picture, right? Some things have improved, but not a lot, but mostly we see a bit of a contraction, not so much on the democracy side, but more on the cultural policy or the cultural support side. So we would then say, what's going on in Belgium in terms of supporting culture when we know that there's a relationship between culture and democracy? Could it then be that a lessening of the indicator on the culture side could be in the future related to a drop on the democracy side? That's the way to think about it. And this is Germany, and it's also a bit of a mixed picture, but overall it's among the countries that are relatively stable. Right? So let me summarize. We have overall a relative stability, but the democracy dimension seems to be eroding slightly. Right? Keep in mind, in some countries, it's not the democracy side that's eroding, but the cultural side. But this is the overall summary for the countries that rank high in both culture and democracy. There are important differences across countries. Right? The top is stable, more or less. The middle-ranking countries really tell us a mixed picture. Right? And we should be concerned about the performance of some of the lower-ranking countries. Right? So the way forward for me, I'm a policy analyst, would be to say, what is it about the policies in the low-ranking countries and the middle-ranking countries that would need correcting, or where would need have a discussion at a country level. Right? So let me thank you for your attention. I look forward to our debate.
Thank you very much, Dr. Enhar. I have been very succinct in the introduction of our panelists, but I did that intentionally to give them maximum time for their presentation. Dr. Enhar is a senior professor of sociology at the Hertie School. The fact that we are starting this panel and this forum with the discussion on interrelationship between culture and democracy is also not accidental. The importance of culture for democracy and the recognition, acknowledgement of that importance is quite separate very often. And we have been working with the Hertie School of Government in order to provide basis for evidence-based policy on our work on culture for democracy. We will continue now with Stefan Lindberg, Director of VDEM from the University of Gothenburg. In the most recent VDEM's democracy report, it is stressed that the third wave of autocratization has been going on for at least 25 years and shows no signs of cresting. That sounds ominous. What are the main factors, in your view, fueling further autocratization globally? Stefan.
Well, thank you. And thanks for the invitation to be here today on this occasion. Slides, please. Yes. So VDEM, Varieties of Democracy, we have 31 million data on democracy, human rights, judicial systems, elections, and so on, all aspects of democracy, essentially all countries in the world from 1900 to the present. We are now in a wave of autocratization that has been ongoing for 25 years. And then we get Trump in the United States. So this year's democracy report, with a picture of Georgia, another country here where the development for democracy is terrible. That report takes all this data and look at the trends for democracy in the world. I'll give you the rundown and where we are at. So here is where we're at right now. At the end of 2024, this is the world map of liberal democracy in the world. Red countries obviously being the pure dictatorships, the blue countries being more democratic. It's a lot of red. It's a lot of more red now than it was 25 years ago. And how did we end up here? Well, so this is the Liberal Democracy Index for the past 50 years. From the 25th of April, 1974, the Carnation Revolution in Portugal. Who's from Portugal here? No? No one from Portugal. Okay. Or you're too shy. Well, anyway, I was going to congratulate you. But anyway, so that set off that third wave of democratization that you can see, and then the end of the Cold War led to this enormous expansion on freedoms and rights in the world. And then there's a little dent here towards the end of this graph. It's not that bad, right? It doesn't look too much. This is country averages, right? Each country counts for one vote, just like in the UN or I guess here in the Council. Now, the problem with that is that the seashells out there in the Indian Ocean, with 90,000 inhabitants, weigh as much in this average as India, with 1.4 billion people, or China. Now, how much democracy we have in the world, does the seashell mean as much as India? Maybe not. So we can weigh this by population, and then think of it as the level of democracy an average global citizen enjoy, and then it looks like this. You have the same upward trend, and then a downward trend that starts much earlier and is much, much more pronounced. By this measure, if you draw a red line backward, like we've done in the graph from the end of 2024, we end up in 1985, the year that Gorbachev came to power in then Soviet Union. The whole enormous expansion of global rights that came with the end of the Cold War on the global scale is eradicated. We can weigh it by territory, it looks similar, and then the last graph here by share of world GDP or wealth. Boom. Then we weigh back before 1974. Right? That graph tells you something about how much democracy is losing out in the world in terms of economic power. That graph can make me sleepless at night. Okay, this means that we are now in a situation where 3 out of 4 people in the world live in autocracies. There are not that many left of us living in democracies. Okay, and then we can look at which countries are right now in change. Right now, democratizing or autocratizing. And then the world map looks like this. Again, a lot red. A few blue countries, and we have Brazil where they got rid of Bolsonaro, a coalition of 9 parties, democracy turning back, but a lot of red. And it's a global trend. You can see parts of Europe there affected, but also all the other parts of the world. And it has been a global trend for the past 25 years. Over the past 50 years, it looks like this. So the blue line there depicts the number of countries democratizing at the same time in each year. And there in the middle of the 1990s, it was 71 countries at the same time moving ahead on democracy. Do you remember that time? I mean, we were happy, right? We were looking forward to the future. Everything was getting better. All young people in here, you're born at the wrong time, okay? That was a good time to live. And then that just goes down, boom. And it's at least 25, maybe 30 years there since the number of countries autocratizing at the same time goes up. And look at the end of the graph. There's never been more countries autocratizing at the same time as now. It's worse than the 1930s. You can say, okay, there are more countries in the world now than there was in 1930s. There's never been a greater share of the world's countries autocratizing at the same time. It's worse than the 1930s in that sense too. The relationship here between disinformation, polarization, and autocratization is incredibly strong. And that also reminds about the 1930s. Then it was called propaganda. Radio was the new medium. Now we call it disinformation, misinformation, lies, fake news, alternative news, and driving polarization and fueling autocratization. We can look at this in different ways. This is just change of means in government, spread of disinformation, and political polarization. In autocratizing countries go up, democratizing countries go down. If we look at it on country level, comparing the last 10 years in all countries, you have government spread of disinformation and political polarization there again. If you're above the diagonal line, it's getting worse. Red marked countries are autocratizing countries. Or we can look at it within countries over time, year by year, and then it looks like this. Hungary, Nicaragua, Serbia. Indicators of polarization and government spread of disinformation go up, democracy goes down, go up, go down, go up, and this is how it looks. And just 1 minute left then on democracy being trumped, also in the United States. So we looked at this in the democracy report, then we had about 8 weeks of his actions, and then we published in a scientific article. Then we had about his first 100 days. We've then looked and sorted all the actions that the Trump administration have taken over the summer into the fall. And I'm just going to say it like this. It's a frontal attack on all democratic norms, institutions, and processes across the board. It's, to me, the totality of the evidence, 1,000 needle sticks, if you like, makes me completely confident in saying that the United States no longer lives up to the basic premises of a democracy. It's now an electoral autocracy, just like we have in the same group as Hungary and Turkey and so on. On that note, let me say thank you. This is our website. All the data is there, everything. And thanks for listening.
Thank you very much, Stefan, for this not exactly uplifting presentation. I'm looking forward to you and me reminiscing of good old times in the backstage afterwards, but I wouldn't like to leave this younger audience, nevertheless, in such a gloomy state. I just reminded me of something that a young Ukrainian woman said to me a few weeks back when we were talking about the situation in Ukraine. And she said, we cannot afford despair. it's too late for pessimism, and I think I'd like to end that with this message. Now, if there were any hopes that Queen McHugh, Executive Director of Article 19, is going to take us into another direction, I'll leave it to her to reveal. Your Global Expression report of 2025 clearly states that 5.6 billion, that is 2/3 of humanity, have less freedom of expression than a decade ago. So that's not starting well. But
Thank you so much. Yes, unfortunately, I think we're in a little bit of an emotional kind of roller coaster here. Started with Helmut's presentation, which is like, yeah, things are, you know, there's some positives, and there's like a boom, kind of going down. So yes, Article 19, we're an international freedom of expression and access to information organization. Starting about 7 years ago, we started publishing a report, the Global Expression Report, which looks at the aspects of freedom of expression and access to information broadly in the world. We take 25 indicators from the VDEM dataset, which is broader than their freedom of expression index and includes elements of kind of internet censorship as well as civil society experience, and also information from the World Bank and some of our own organizations' research to produce the report every year. So thank you for stealing the headline, but freedom of expression globally is at its lowest ebb since the Cold War. Not surprising, given what Staffan has just said, but also not surprising because if you look at the data from VDEM and our own information, one of the things that you see very clearly is that in autocratizing states, one of the very first things that is attacked is freedom of expression. Owning control of information, of data, of how people perceive reality is one of the fundamental ways that autocracies can rise and take power. And so it's not surprising that we would say you are going to see a decline in freedom of expression in the world since 2025. At the same time, you're seeing autocratization. They definitely go hand in hand. Some of the declines that we're seeing around the world are driven by attacks on the media as well as attacks on civil society, and repression of civil society. And I'll get a little bit more into this. In terms of the state of the world, you can kind of look at the map there. Western Europe is one of the strongest areas in terms of countries that are ranked on our scale from in crisis all the way up to open, the green being open, the dark red ones being in crisis, and different ones in between. So if you look at the map, it looks, again, Western Europe, the Americas, generally good, but I'll say that that actually is masking a lot of declines that'll show you a little bit in the data going forward. In just basic numbers, you can see in terms of the countries in each of the category, we currently have, in this year's data, which actually 2024 data, 43 countries that were listed in crisis, but only 35 countries that were listed as open. As Staffan was saying, if you look at that in terms of the percentage of population and the numbers of people, that's 2.8 million people living in countries in crisis, 2.8 billion, excuse me, countries in crisis, where only 1 billion basically in countries that are open. You know, put another way, there are way more people in the world that right now have never experienced a true openness of expression where they can speak without fear. And that's incredibly worrying. One of the things that we look at in the data set, oh, sorry, I skipped a slide. Nope, I didn't. I thought I had, but I didn't. One of the things that we look in the data set is not just on a year basis, but like trends over time. And looking at what we call kind of the global advancers and decliners. So over the past 10 years, again, not great data. There's been 77 countries where there's been a decline in freedom of expression, and only 15 where we've seen an advance. Some of those countries are the ones that we've seen, Brazil, Zambia. Sometimes you see a U-turn. For example, we have done a lot of work in Tunisia, where they're following the Arab Spring. There was a lot of promise in Tunisia, a lot of democratization, a lot of expansion of freedom of expression. They had some of the strongest access to information and media regulatory laws in Africa and in the world at one point, and now they have had a pretty significant U-turn. So it can go both ways. You can have democratization and autocratization, and freedom of expression is reflective of that. So just to summarize where we are right now, in this year, 77 countries' expression scores have declined over the last decade. That means only 15% of the world's population currently live in countries that we rank as open, 15%. So it's even worse than Stafan's 25%. And that is because, again, attacks on expression are the vanguard of attacks on democracy, and that's what we're seeing. This is the canary in the coal mine. That means also that in the past 10 years, 5.6 billion people have seen a decline in their freedom of expression. If we dig a little bit deeper into this, I wanted to look at some of the aspects of the freedom of expression scores, particularly around media freedom. And when we're talking about media freedom in our report, we're looking specifically at 3 of the indicators combined, which are government censorship of the media, media self-censorship, and harassment of journalists. So again, if you look at those 3 indicators in aggregate, you could see the world has declined quite significantly over the last 10 years. So 27 countries have had decline in at least 1 indicator. There have been some advancers during that time, so not to be incredibly gloomy, trying to push this forward. So you can see that, again, there is things to learn. There are things where you can make advances. You can turn freedom of expression around. Because if we're looking at an overall decline in the past 25 years, but in the last 10, there have been some advances in some places. One of the things that we wanted to specifically point out is that there are certain things where there are consequences. You know, overall, if you look at the trend line, it's kind of a gradual global score decline. But as we've seen with the other presentations, context matters and countries matter. You can see really dramatic increases. You can see very rapid advances in freedom of expression, as well as very rapid declines in freedom of expression. Things that drive this, elections do have consequences for this. You can see U-turns in expressive scores. You also can see people-powered movements that can drive governments change, that can have impacts on positive movements in freedom of expression. So I think that the title of this is, how do we revive democracy? You know, we shouldn't give up. You can actually see advance, but it does take organization, and it takes structures, and it takes systems in place that will actually allow for democracy to rebound. One thing I just wanted to end a little bit here, since we are at the Council of Europe, wanted to look at one of the indicators that we have, which is the advancers and decliners, specifically looking at freedom from government censorship efforts. And I wanted to highlight this here in the Council of Europe. Again, if you look at the overall map, then the highest number of countries listed as open on freedom of expression is in Europe. But if you actually look at the number of decliners, where there have been declines in the quality of freedom of expression, Europe is not out of the woods, and this includes Central Asia as well. There are worrying declines that we have seen in different states in Europe. As well as the highest number of advancers, there is the highest number of decliners. And so that's something I think that requires a lot more investigation and thought and reflection, because we cannot take where we are right now in Europe in these open countries for granted. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Quinn. We now turn to our 4th and last panelist in this first round, Laura Silver, Associate Director of Global Research, Pew Research Center, where we expect perhaps to hear more about the reasons why the picture is as gloomy as it emerges from the first 3 panelists' presentations.
I'll certainly be focusing on a different form of data, because what we just heard is a lot about the structural composition of political systems, and what I'm going to focus on is how the people feel about the state of democracy, which is not necessarily more uplifting, but we'll get into it. Just briefly, who we are as an organization, nonprofit, nonpartisan, we call ourselves a fact tank as opposed to a think tank, because we're not making policy. Our goal is to actually put the public into the dialogue, to give the voice to people around the world, and to have that kind of voice reflected in policy discussions like these ones, even if we ourselves are not making the policy. Most of the data I'm going to be showing you today comes from our spring survey, We did surveys in 25 countries from around January to April of this past year with with slightly more than 28,000 respondents. We do our surveys in all continents, inhabited continents, and in each country we use nationally representative methods. All of the data that I present is also available online and people can download it and analyze it themselves. But let's start with how people feel about democracy in their own countries. What you're looking at here is a median. It's 12 high-income countries that we've been surveying consistently over time since 2017. We have data from more than just the high-income countries, but because of kind of the COVID interruption, for a while we were only able, during the pandemic, to survey in high-income countries. So you're looking at kind of the average over time. And what you'll see if you look at the right side of the graph is that people are more dissatisfied than satisfied. About 2/3 of people in these 12 high-income countries say that they're dissatisfied with the way democracy is working in their country, whereas around 1/3 are satisfied. There hasn't been major change in the last few years. People have stayed dissatisfied. In fact, the increases that we see are largely ones that kind of started during COVID and have stayed more negative. People are more dissatisfied than not, though there is country-level variation, and certain countries, like Sweden, usually stand out as relatively satisfied compared to many others, including Italy, France, Greece, and many others, even among the high-income countries. So why is this? I don't have causal data to tell you exactly why, but I can point to some correlations, much as we've been doing across the panel. And one correlation is certainly economic. So what you're looking at here is the percent of people who say that the current economic situation in their country is good, as well as the percent who are satisfied with the way democracy is working in their country. So at the kind of top right of the graph, you see that in some of kind of the middle income countries like India and Indonesia, where large shares of people think that their economy is in good shape, they're also relatively more satisfied with democracy. This does not mean that their countries are necessarily performing better democratically, as I think some of the data we just saw about India would suggest, but it does mean that people are more satisfied with how things are going. Kind of on the bottom left, places like South Korea, Japan, Greece, Italy, France, people are more dissatisfied. It's also important to note that these are kind of views of the economy. These are not GDP per capita. These are not growth rates. These are how people feel things are going economically in their countries. And in fact, that assessment alone can be quite partisan. When we see elections take place, we often see who's satisfied with the economy and who's satisfied with democracy flip. That's very much the case in the United States, but the United States is not alone in this. We also saw this following the German elections and following the British elections, for example, over the past year. But thinking that the economy is in good shape is also related to thinking that democracy is in good shape. But one of the major things that we see when it comes to democratic dissatisfaction has to do with the elites, the people in power. This past year, we asked everyone whether or not they think all or most of the elected officials in their country, just some, or few or none, have the following attributes: whether or not they're honest, they understand the needs of ordinary people, they focus on the most important problems, they're ethical, or they're well qualified for their position. And here what you're looking at is medians from the 25 countries that we surveyed, so the high income and the middle income countries as one. And what you see is there's very limited praise of elected officials. In fact, in places around the world, we see that more people are likely to say that few or none of the elected officials in their country are honest or understand the needs of ordinary people, and they say these at high rates. In fact, politicians are such a source of discontent that in 2023, when we asked an open-ended question about what you could do to improve democracy in your country, the top thing that people said in almost every country that we surveyed was change the elites, change the politicians. They could have said anything, and in a few countries, some people did say other things, like improve the judicial system. That was the case in Israel, notably prior to the October 7th attack, or change the economic structure, as was the case in South Africa or India. But in most places, they focused on the politicians. What do people want to change about their politicians? Well, three major themes were dominant. Some people want to change who is in politics. They want their leaders to look different or to come from different demographic groups. Sometimes this was be younger. Sometimes this was we need more women. Sometimes it was we need more people who represent Christian ideology. It could take a lot of forms, but it was different people. Sometimes the emphasis was on competence. People wanted the people making laws about, say, vaccines or wind power to understand those things at higher rates, more kind of technocracy. And some people simply wanted responsiveness. They want politicians to change their behaviors because they want to have more of a voice. It's not simple, though, because we hear in the same country sometimes two different approaches to the same issue, meaning it's difficult to satisfy everyone. I put up two quotes from the United States, but basically, when people want to change their politicians, some people want them to look different and not be as rich, Christian, and old, as you see on the left. And other people don't want any emphasis on what might be termed DEI. They don't want race, ethnicity, or gender to be factored in. So it's very difficult to appease everyone. The one thing uniting people in many of the places that we survey is that they want different elites. Unfortunately, there's little uniting them when it comes to how they want to change the elites. What's interesting, though, is that there's now a sense of kind of despondency that we're seeing in our data. So what you're looking at is the combination of two different questions that we asked this past year. We asked whether or not people's political system needs minor changes or no changes, which is what you see in blue. And then we also asked whether it could use major changes or complete reform, which is what you see in green. But we did a follow-up question about whether or not they're confident that it can be changed among those who said that it needed complete reform or major changes. What you see in the dark green is the share of people who think that their political system needs complete or major reform and are not confident that it can change. Greece really stands out. Around 2/3 of people want basically an overhaul and don't think that it'll happen, but around half or more say the same in France, Spain, Italy, South Korea, the US, and Japan, and then still around 4 in 10 in some other places. A few countries stand out for not being quite as pessimistic. You see, for example, in Australia, around half don't really think that they need much change. And it's even higher in places like the Netherlands and Sweden, two places that often stand out in our data for being relatively satisfied with the states of their democracy. And again, relatively positive also in, for example, Germany and Canada, two other places that tend to be quite satisfied relative to our global data at least. So we have a system where very few people in many countries are satisfied. Most people don't think that their elites are honest or working for the people, and they don't have any confidence that things can change. Here's my single uplifting slide. We have also asked over time whether or not people think social media is a way to change things. The data you're seeing are from 2022. We're re-asking these questions this year. But at least at that time, what we saw was that people were relatively positive about the role that social media could have in changing people's minds about political or social issues, raising public awareness, or, in particular, getting elected officials to pay attention to issues and influencing policy decisions. So people aren't confident in change, but perhaps they feel like they can have a voice in one particular way, which might be kind of outside of the traditional media landscape. That said, we're kind of coming to a new point where people are more concerned than not about parts of the changing media landscape, and that's AI. This past year, for the first time, we did a global survey that touched on artificial intelligence. And we asked people whether the increased use of artificial intelligence in daily life makes them feel more excited than concerned, which you see a median of 16% said. Equally concerned and excited, kind of the plurality position, a median of 42% said this, or more concerned than excited, which is 34%. We also asked whether or not people trust different countries or organizations to regulate artificial intelligence. And I think this is interesting kind of in the context of how people feel about political elite. People are relatively trusting, on balance, of the EU's ability to regulate artificial intelligence and to some extent their own country, but they're not confident when it comes to the US or China's ability to do so. There's a fair bit of skepticism that we're going to be able to meet the moment. And in the US in particular, where we've done more work on this, we see that people generally don't feel like they have a lot of control over how AI is used in their lives, and they would like more control. So there's this balance at this moment where people may be relatively optimistic about social media and its ability to kind of bypass the system that they're not confident in, or bypass the elite that they're not confident in, but they're not quite comfortable with the state of things. And at least when it comes to American adults, many people are actually worried that AI itself will have a negative impact on elections over the next 20 years. So there was a little bit of hope there, but there may be a little bit of kind of trepidation, and we'll have to kind of watch over the coming years how the public begins to grapple with these major changes that we're going to see. So I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Laura. We have a lot of facts in very little time. Before we continue and unfortunately also conclude, I'd just like to make two brief points. The first one is when we are inviting you for this session, we ask you to deliver your analysis as it emerges from your research without moderation, self-censorship or any restraints, and delivered you did. Of course, it is a sobering picture that emerges from those presentations, but it's not a surprising one. And I think it's analysis that has also been shared by a majority of Council member states when they have decided to hold its summit of heads of state and government in order to identify and articulate a response to what has been described as democratic backsliding. And as a result, that major initiative, the process towards a new democratic pact in Europe, has been put in place. The first part is going on now. It is really a broadest possible conversation about the issues that have been raised today, about the reasons for the problems, about the ways those problems are manifested, and in particular about the possible solutions on how to make democracies more sustainable, more resilient in that very challenging times we live in. The QR codes that you have already mentioned are a part of that conversation. So please, I really encourage you to use it and express your opinion. They will be a part and they will be taken into account in that conversation that will be at the later stage transformed into a set of policy recommendations that will be presented to the governments of member states. My second point is that after time for facts should come a time for action. And in your concluding remarks, which you will have 2 minutes each, I'm afraid not more, just about, I'd like to invite you really to reflect on the future. On the basis of what you have said, what do you think, in your view, should be the most important, the most effective ways to change that situation that has emerged from your presentation? How to make things better?
Yeah, thank you. That's the ultimate question, really. I want to start giving you the answer by looking at what we actually already know. In the United States, if you look at this pamphlet that was put together called Project 25, this is like a recipe book of what has already happened and is what is going to happen. So read Project 25 or whatever the equivalent in your country would be very, very carefully. And there are things you can do. We know that autocrats like to go after cultural institutions very early on. And we heard that in Quinn's presentation, right? So freedom for expression, that includes universities, that includes arts and cultural institutions and the like. You need to make sure that your bylaws, your articles of incorporation, your tax status and so is inoculated somehow, that you have a strong internal governance that makes it more difficult for an autocratic takeover, right? So something that we saw happening in Washington where Donald Trump makes himself the chairman of the, what's it called? Of the Kennedy Center, should not happen. The way Orban pushed out the Central European University should not happen. But why are cultural institutions such easy targets? Because they are about the narrative. They're about systems of meaning and how we interpret reality and how we see changes. And autocrats want to control that and make it as difficult for them as possible.
Thank you very much. Stefan, your 2 minutes.
Yeah. What does science know about this? How do we stop autocratization and turn it around? So we know a few things. In all the cases where, almost all the cases where a process of autocratization has been turned around and a broad coalition of civil society and political parties across the spectrum and across other divides unite for democracy and against autocratization. So that mobilization is really critical for preserving or restoring democracy. We know two other things in 1 minute. One thing that ties to what Laura said, but also Quinn, disinformation plays an enormous role in autocratization processes, closing down regular media, but then pursuing other narratives in social media, alternative media, and with falsehoods that we as citizens start to believe in. And that's why it makes me worried when they say in your polls that, oh, social media is a great avenue for political change. Well, mostly the wrong kind of political change, doing away with democracy. That's what's happening. And we know that the algorithms are written to promote these extremist, polarizing messages, and increasingly so now under Trump with Musk control over X and so on and so forth. We know that. Thirdly, we also know by increasing evidence that the enormous increase in socioeconomic relative inequality across the world that has reached very high levels is also a fertile ground for support for these radical, extreme, right-wing, nationalist, anti-democratic parties and groups, just like in the 1930s. So that also needs to be countered.
Quinn?
All right, I'm going to try and lift the mood just a little bit, but everything that my colleagues have said is true. To take a little bit off of what Stefan was saying, and maybe this is a little bit of an exhortation for us all. There are some things that are absolutely critical if you're going to have an effective fight back. One is narrative and having the means of getting your message out there. And so support for media, support for social media regulation, a bit of a radical thing coming from an American to say that in Europe, but it's true. Very, very crucial. And I know that Europe is being beaten up a lot now by the United States on social media regulation. I would say do not lose sight of the importance of maintaining control over that space and control over the narrative. Very, very critical at this point. The rest of the world is watching to see what Europe is going to do on social media and social media regulation. So keep that in mind. Another final thing to say, reflecting again on Stefan, is we know that change can happen quickly, but it doesn't happen spontaneously if you don't have investment in basically, call it the resistance in society. That means continued investment in independent media, continued investment in civil society, continued investment in things that look pointless right now. There's so many places in the world where like democracy looked hopeless. Like, oh my God, like look at the Gambia. Never gonna happen. But there was a lot of investment to try and support independent media under the radar, to support like movements of people supporting each other, to support civil society. Right now it's become very popular to say civil society is the problem. Don't fall for that. Without civil society as part of this fabric of resistance, there will not be the ability to seize the moment of democratic change.
Thank you, Quinn. And finally, Laura.
I think what comes through in our data is that people want to be respected and they want to be listened to. That can happen from any party, depending on how it's messaged. And so it's important that people kind of across the aisle figure out how to reach people and how to make them feel like they're listened to. Because I think what came through, hopefully in my slides, is that that's not how people feel right now. They don't think that their elites are in touch. They don't think that their elites are honest or focused on the right issues. Getting the message out and getting the narrative out that people can then believe and feel like people are paying attention to their ordinary lives is going to be really important. Ultimately, people vote for a lot of reasons. Some of it is economic, some of it is identity-based, some of it is cultural, but everyone wants to feel listened to and cared for and believe that the people that they're voting for will listen to them and improve their lives.
Thank you very much, Laura. So that was from time for facts to time for action. I will not make any attempt to summarize this discussion. We will soon begin with the opening ceremony of this year's World Forum of Democracy. I'd like to thank the panelists for this presentation. I think it has been extremely interesting. It has not been entertaining, it was not meant to be, but I think it was a very, very good introduction into this World Forum. I'll just perhaps, in conclusion, go back to Queen Yor call for narratives and quote another example from Ukraine, which has been for me personally, not for me in recent years, really an endless source of inspiration when it comes to courage and determination for standing up for democracy when it's really, really difficult and really, really dangerous. And that's the motto of European Youth Capital for 2025, which is Lviv in Ukraine. They will be capital for a couple of weeks more. And that motto is, it's hard, but move. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Matthias, and all of your panelists for giving us this introduction. And to those of you who have just joined us, welcome to this, the 13th edition of the World Forum for Democracy, addressing the question, democracy at risk. How can we revive it? My name is Alex Taylor. I'm a European journalist. It's my pleasure once again to be hosting this event. I recognize quite a few faces. Thank you very much. And also, maybe a big round of applause to those who are watching us streaming, sometimes all by themselves. So if you could give them a big round of applause to those of us around the world who are watching us. Just a reminder, there is the QR code. We really want to hear your points of view. You can answer the questions. We're leaving it up for a little while. Apparently it was difficult for some people to get it. So there we are, the QR code, so that you can give us your points of view. So according to global survey data, citizens are increasingly dissatisfied, as we have just heard in the previous session, with democracy for reasons which include, among other things, the growing economic inequality, seismic shifts in technology, and the feeling generally that citizens' voices are ignored. That's why we want to hear your voices, first of all, with the QR code. So please go ahead and give us some indication of what you're thinking. The lack of trust in democratic institutions and processes undermines democratic legitimacy, stability, and resilience to both external and internal threats. When citizens are no longer invested in democracy, they may gradually withdraw from voting and other forms of participation in civic life, leaving the fundamental freedoms that underpin democratic institutions increasingly vulnerable, as we see more and more in the news. In this context, journalism, arts and culture are essential elements of democratic resilience, serving as vital channels for pluralism, inclusiveness and public engagement. But then again, we have all kinds of questions to do with technology, and especially AI, and the way that different politicians use this for manipulation, disinformation campaigns, and the amplification of divisive and polarizing content. That's why it's so good to see so many young people here, because you are not only the most active users of digital platforms, but in many societies, a demographically declining group, which raises many questions about the ways in which you participate and influence democracy in general. So in light of the urgency of all these challenges, the forum will explore ways of raising understanding among citizens of the risks posed by populism for your and our fundamental rights and freedoms. This event, ladies and gentlemen, is a contribution towards a new democratic pact for Europe, which is a strategic and political consultation process launched by the Council of Europe to find solutions to reinforce the foundations of democracy amplify its benefits, restore trust, and innovate its form. The results will shape the future work of the Council of Europe to make democracy tangible and meaningful for all. So thank you very much. That was a general introduction to the theme of the next 3 days. However, before moving on to addressing these issues, it is time to hear a few words from the President of the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe. I'm sure you're going to give him a big round of applause. Please welcome Mr. Theodoros Rousopoulos. Mr. Rousopoulos.
Great accent, Alex. Thank you. Good morning, dear participants. The old miners used to walk deep underground, in darkness and danger. Every day they faced the risk of collapse, of toxic air, of death. Their survival depended on two things: on the pillars that carried the burden of an unstable ceiling, and on one another. They knew that a single mistake could bring down the whole mine. So they planned together, trusted each other, and worked in coordination. Their safety was not an individual matter. It was a shared responsibility. Among the simple tools they used for protection, what was something very interesting, fragile and vital: a small canary in a cage. The canary did not sing, and of course it did not sing for beauty's sake. It was there because it was the first to sense the poison in the air. When the bird stopped singing, the miners knew that something was wrong. The danger was near. Today, dear friends, democracy itself, it's our mine. And we are all miners, working, arguing, sometimes shouting, but sharing the same underground space. The pillars that hold the structure are trust, solidarity, and accountability. When one breaks, when trust collapses, when disinformation spreads, when dialogue gives way to division, the whole structure trembles. And who are the canaries of our democratic world? It is our youth. They are the first to feel that the air has become toxic. When politics become cynical, when institutions fail to listen, when ideals are replaced by fear or manipulation, then the youth stop singing, not because they are indifferent, but because they cannot breathe in an atmosphere that no longer feels honest or fair. If we lose their voice, we lose our warning signal. If we silence their hope, we risk the collapse of the whole structure. Our task as leaders, citizens, and institutions is not only to protect the pillars of democracy, but to listen to the canaries, to those who feel first that something is wrong, to give them the trust they need and deserve, the trust they offer. Let us therefore, dear friends, rebuild that trust. Let us make participation meaningful, dialogue open, and equality real. Because democracy, like a mine, cannot survive without oxygen, and oxygen in our time is trust. If we preserve it, the canary will keep singing. And where there is song, there is still life. And there is still hope for democracy. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Rousopoulos. We have another special guest with us here today. I'm delighted to ask onto the stage the representative of the Presidency of Malta of the Committee of Ministers of the Council of Europe, Dr. Jonathan Attard, Minister of Justice.
Thank you and good morning. Secretary General of the Council of Europe, Mr. Alain Berset, President of the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe, Mr. Theodoros Rossopoulos, Excellencies, distinguished colleagues and speakers, friends of democracy. It is my distinct honor to open on behalf of my country, Malta, in this year's World Forum for Democracy, a vital space for reflection, dialogue, and renewal. The theme, Democracy at Risk, how can we revive it, confronts us with a profound question, not only about our institutions, but about our collective imagination. What does it mean in our time to live democratically? Across the globe, we are witnessing a growing sense of disillusionment, a quiet unease. The foundation of trust are shifting, citizens are losing faith in systems that once promised hope, unity, and progress. The story of democracy once told with confidence now feels unfinished and even uncertain sometimes. But this is not a moment of despair, it's a moment for renewal, for rediscovering democracy not merely as a structure of governance, but as a shared human endeavor, an ever-evolving dialogue between power and people, rights and responsibilities, freedom and truth. Too often our discussion focuses heavily on the structural and architectural elements of democracy, institutions, elections, and legal frameworks. These are essential, yet there are only the bones. The life of democracy lies elsewhere, in the participation of citizens, in the courage to listen, and in the humility to lead. A healthy democracy is not sustained by laws alone, but by trust, empathy, and engagement, by the daily practice of respect for difference and belief in the common good. Democracy at its heart is not just about listening, it's also about acting with conviction. Consultation must be followed by decision. Participation must be matched by purpose. Otherwise, we risk mistaking dialogue for progress. In the context, I firmly believe that Malta has a meaningful contribution to make. In recent years, we have indeed embarked on an ambitious program of democratic renewal, one that reflects our commitment to strengthening the foundation of justice, transparency, and trust. Our justice and governance reforms have strengthened the independence of key institutions, modernized the judiciary, and enhanced transparency and accountability across public life. We have reformed the processes for judicial appointments and discipline, reinforced the autonomy of the Attorney General and the State Advocate, and introduced stronger checks and balances between the executive, the legislative, and judicial branches. These reforms were carried out in close dialogue with the Council of Europe, with the Venice Commission, and the European partners. Their expertise and engagement have helped us build a justice system that is not only efficient, but trusted, not only functional, but faithful to the spirit of democracy itself. We have also placed renowned emphasis on freedom and independence of the media, the lifeblood of public discourse. Just last week, Malta concluded a public consultation on media reform, and this paved the way for the drafting of the new legislation or the new legislative amendments that will strengthen the protection of journalists, building on the progress already made in this vital sector. We are proud to be the first country to adopt the EU Anti-SLAPP Directive, standing firmly against abusive lawsuits that seek to silence public interest journalism. This reflects our unwavering conviction that a democracy without a free press is a democracy without breadth. Yet reforms alone are never enough. Institutions may provide the framework, but it is citizens who give democracy its soul. That is why Malta is investing in civic education, digital literacy, and participatory mechanisms that empower people, especially young people, to engage meaningfully in public life. We believe that democracy must be learned, lived, and renewed with every generation. In an age marked by disinformation, polarization, and technological disruption, our task is to rebuild trust, not through nostalgia for the past, but through a new democratic imagination anchored in human dignity, solidarity, and truth. Malta stands firmly by the values that underpin the Council of Europe: human rights, democracy, and the rule of law. We believe that the new Democratic Pact for Europe offers an opportunity, perhaps even a moral imperative, to renew the democratic promise across our continent. And as we continue these important conversations, I am delighted that Malta's presidency will also offer a moment of cultural reflection later today at 2 p.m. on the right-hand side of the lobby of the hemicycle with the inauguration of the exhibition Fragile Foundations. Through this vision of 4 exceptional Maltese talents, the statistic dialogue on resilience and renewal will mirror our shared effort to strengthen democracy, strengthen democracy's own foundation, fragile at times, yet capable of enduring through creativity, courage, and hope. Before I conclude, allow me to express Malta's deep appreciation to our permanent representation to the Council of Europe. Their dedication during Malta's presidency has been instrumental in advancing key priorities and strengthening dialogue across member states. Through their commitment, Malta has helped to reinforce the cooperative spirit that defines this institution and indeed our shared European project. Let us therefore work together, governments and citizens, institutions and communities, to ensure that democracy remains not merely a system of governance, but a living promise, a promise of dignity, justice and freedom for all. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Dr. Attard, for those welcoming words. We're now going to meet the partners. We're going to switch languages into French. I'll give you a few seconds if you need to put on your headphones, because the next part will be in French. Nous allons rencontrer maintenant les partenaires.
We will now be talking with our partners, since we are organizing the forum with the Council of Europe and French authorities under the high patronage of President Macron. And I'd like you to join me in welcoming our partners. The Director of Global Affairs of the Ministry for Europe and Foreign Affairs, Salina Grene-Cataluna. Welcome to you. Please take a seat. It's also my pleasure to welcome the Vice President of the region, Grand Est, Brigitte Torloting. Welcome. Alsace, member of the Regional Council, delegate for strengthening democratic engagement and European democracy in Alsace, Pascal Pfeiffer. Thank you for being with us. And obviously, as every year, I have the pleasure to welcome the Mayor of Strasbourg, Jeanne Barsekian. Thank you for joining us, and thank you for welcoming us to your beautiful city. We have welcomed the Director of Global Affairs at the Ministry for European and Foreign Affairs, Mrs. Salina Grene-Cataluna. Could you perhaps explain the importance of this forum for your authorities? And please applaud her.
Des applaudissements chaleureux. Merci à vous.
Monsieur le Secrétaire Général.
Mr. Secretary General, Mr. President of the Parliamentary Assembly, ladies and gentlemen, ministers, Mrs. Mayor, Mrs. Vice President of the region, and Alsace Councillor, ladies and gentlemen, Excellencies, I'm so pleased to be here to represent the Ministry for Europe and Foreign Affairs of France. A month ago, the Minister, Jean-Noël Barrot, gave a speech on democracy in the United States at Harvard University, where he restated the role of democracy for worldwide development, restating what has united us, our common values for a common project for our societies based on freedom, equality, justice, and law. He mentioned the difficulties that democracy encounters today. In the heart of his speech, he mentioned this Europe, our Europe, which now knows war, destabilization, which is threatened but still resolute and determined. It is at the heart of Europe here, represented by Strasbourg and the European institutions that are based here, that I would like to pay tribute to this place of resilience in the defense of the democratic project and the way it needs to be reinvented. Europe is the cradle of democracy and pluralism, bringing together different identities, political cultures, rule of law, peace, compliance with fundamental rights are the pillars of this common project, which is at the basis of multilateralism, is under threat. Our institutions, rule of law, access to information, principles we thought to be permanent are now threatened with disinformation. These attacks all converge on on fighting our principles, our values, using vulnerabilities, disinforming, and intimidating. I think we all agree that it's urgent now to defend democracy, and Europe is already mobilized. And in spite of the many very real threats and the democratic fatigue that we need to see, the figures see that there is a persistent democratic aspiration worldwide. So we need to build a positive agenda for democracy. The citizens' commitment, as Claude Lefort said, reminds us that democracy is a place for questions, for debates, questioning laws, powers, society, and therefore we need to reflect on the changes. Democracy is never finished. It adjusts, it changes, it uses new expectations coming from the young generation, which are very vocal in some parts of the world today. Europe is an anchor for democratic values owing to its institutions and for everything it represents in the defense of international law. For the world, we are the pillar of this collective resistance, but also a pillar of innovation. Our role is more important than ever today. It needs to be our objective, showing the right path, and here the Council of Europe is what safeguards the protection of human rights and the stability of these rights when the European Convention is celebrating its 75 years this year. But the Council of Europe is a laboratory for democracy also, and that is the very purpose of the new pact launched by the Secretary General, Alain Berset. I'd like to pay tribute for him. It's about cooperation and inclusion, revitalizing democracy that's owing to Europe, in Europe, working together at a time when multilateralism is being questioned. Those who want to escape the law and represent the challenge that we have faced call for common replies. And we have in our ministry 2 avenues that we use. We need to open the democratic horizon, mobilize more for a consistent democratic project. We need to include the environment more, climatic justice, biodiversity, environmental transition. Those are the elements that our young generation is expecting. Changing our democracy, revitalizing it, is also accepting that there are different voices in our democracy. We need to see democracy no longer as a universal model, but as a multiple model. As the philosopher Bachandian from Senegal said, the universal needs to be shared. We need to share common principles, and it makes sense only if it finds its roots in specific experiences, and we need to also look at different experiences, Brazil, South Africa, Senegal, and other countries. There must be citizen participation, and in all these challenges, we are present. That is what we've been doing for many years with the Council of Europe, the Grand Est region, Alsace, and the city of Strasbourg, because this World Forum must be able to contribute to common thinking. Democracy must be a living promise. Thank you to all of you, institutions, students, researchers, associations, all of you who came today. You are proof that you are still the motor, the engine of the largest democratic space on the planet. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup à Lina.
Thank you to Mrs. Grenet-Catalano. I lived in Nancy and Strasbourg for many years, and I know how the Grand Est is a region where urban and rural realities seem sometimes a bit remote. What you do to reinforce the link between elected representatives and citizens in your region, for them to have the feeling that they are real participants in the democratic process. The region has decided to create 12 regional centers. We have 5.5 million inhabitants here, and through these centers they can be closer to decision-making. Each citizen is at a maximum of 80 kilometers of one of the centers where municipalities, citizens, associations can turn to meet people who are part of these centers to discuss any topic relevant and within the remit of the region. That is considerable progress compared to the very centralized model. Strasbourg is the center of our region, although it's not exactly at the center of the region. That's one thing. And also, we all have seen that there is a divide between the rural and urban populations, but we want rural population to meet the people who look after the rural areas on various topics. The second thing that we did is that we decided to organize meetings with citizens, associations, authorities on the very topics that are within our remit. So on a monthly basis, the whole of the executive goes to one of the départements for 6 visits, a meeting in the evening to discuss the various major topics at hand with the explanation provided. Of course, we listen. We need to listen a lot, but we also need to be able to provide answers to the questions. And that all fuels into the decision-making process. And then the third thing that we did, because we see that this divide is growing between rural and urban areas, we now have a roadmap on the pact for rural areas with all the specific topics, more specific to the rural areas, with policies, with small activities, small projects, which was much appreciated also by associations that work in rural areas. And we have a youth regional council that we consult on all of the decisions, all of the actions and projects we're implementing. Some of them are very specific, and each vice president is in touch with our youth regional council. It's a way of ensuring participation of youth, and faced with all the major challenges that we have before us, we want to be able to listen to them, but we want them to participate. Fourthly, in our region, we have the trans-border activities. We have the Euro district. Each Euro district organizes its own citizen consultation so that trans-border topics, which are very important here in our region, can be heard and understood. And then we work on Grand Est proximity centers where we organize consultations on various topics. The region of tomorrow needs to be prepared today. We organize a way of consulting on specific questions. Well, thank you very much for very practical examples, Brigitte Torlotin. You're the Vice President of the Grand Est region, and you are responsible for international relations. Pascal Pfeffer, you are Alsace Councillor, Delegate for Strengthening Democratic Engagement and European Democracy. Could you explain what Alsace is doing for education for peace? Yes, thank you. Well, it's a great honor to host this forum in Strasbourg in Alsace. Therefore, I'd like to recall that we here have suffered much from the absence of peace. We were annexed by Germany in 1870. We became re-French in 1718. Then we were annexed once again by Germany in 1940 and became French again in 1945. So here you see, we know what it means not to have peace. And we always wanted to keep the memory alive. We are a place that works for German-French reconciliation at first, our neighbors, who were cause of much suffering, our best friends today. How do you educate the young generation? The Canaries, I liked the idea that was presented to us. Under the French system, the départements, such as ours, have middle school within their remit. The buildings, the management, the maintenance of the buildings, but we also have educational programs to raise awareness of our young adolescents to the many important values such as peace. In urban areas, they need to learn to show more respect, more tolerance for others at school, where different cultures come together. So what do we do practically? Well, we organize visits to the only concentration camp in France, here in the Vosges, the Struthof. It's always quite an experience for them. We do that for various reasons. For instance, to prepare them for the future. We also enable them to travel to the wider region to learn of its history and how peace was constructed. We support the Observatory of the Learning of History, which is based here at the Council of Europe.
The observatory is here to transmit history in an objective way, and we want to respect the lived experiences of everybody on a common basis, European basis, and we send 2 volunteers. It's called a civic service, and they go round schools in Alsace to talk about Europe. Peace is the synonym of Europe as far as we're concerned. Europe is the single currency, is structural funding, it's cooperation between borders, but Europe is first and foremost peace. This is what Europe is about, and we want to say that to young people. So 2 people that go around secondary schools to talk about Europe and peace. And there are also special meetings. We bring together hundreds of young people at the European Parliament. They sing the European anthem. It's a great experience for these children and younger people. They become ambassadors for peace. And in Strasbourg and Colmar, there is a wall of Europe. Everybody in Strasbourg, in Colmar, can write something on that wall about Europe, about peace. You can criticize Europe as well on the wall, but at least there is a strong conscience about Europe. Peace is not only memories, historical knowledge. When you take an exam, peace is something you work on a daily basis. Our authorities, the European Authority of Alsace, this is something that we work on every day with our neighbors, with young people in school, and we work on memories as well. When I was younger, I thought to myself, why do we go to memorials? Well, it's important we remember that the lack of peace is a lot of people dying and suffering. Thank you. Thank you very much. When I came here at my hotel this morning, I came on foot, and there's a statue I saw in Place de la République. It's a mother with two dead sons. One is German, one is French. It's an extraordinary statue in the Place de la République that says a lot. Madam Mayor, thank you for welcoming us. Now, digitalization influences the way in which citizens get their information. There's a lot of disinformation, fake news. What digital tools do you use locally to strengthen democracy and to fight against the scourge of disinformation? Hello, everyone. Welcome to Strasbourg. I'm really happy to be here and to see you in the city of Strasbourg. We're hosting the forum. I usually say that in Strasbourg, the history of Europe is being written, and its future as well. As Pascal Pfeiffer said just now, there is this statue in the Place de la République that shows that Strasbourg is a symbol now of a reconciliation, of peace in Europe. Yesterday, we celebrated the 75th anniversary of the Human Rights Convention. That's very important as well. We're happy that the Secretary General, that the Court's President, the representative of Malta, everybody reminisced about what the founding fathers of Europe wanted. We remembered how important our values are, especially now that democracy, the rule of law, and human rights are under assault. It's indispensable that together today we still write the history of Europe. Now, said it's under attack, under assault, democracy. I'm thinking about fake news, disinformation. This is something that we're confronted with every day on social media or the traditional media. It's an international problem, a national problem, but also a local problem. There are lies, disinformation. I see that every day. I'm not saying that digitalization is necessarily an enemy of democracy. No, in Strasbourg, for example, we have participatory platforms. They're used more and more by people, by citizens, and it makes it possible for them to express their opinions, to contribute to projects, to vote online on participatory budgets. It's very important, but it's not enough in itself. First of all, there needs to be digital inclusion. Not everybody is familiar with those tools, not necessarily older people, but anybody can suffer from a lack of digital literacy, so we need to include everybody. The tools are not enough. We need to make sure everybody can contribute, and we need to help people where they live, in supermarkets, in cinemas, in parks. We need to be there for people, and we need to have people that have a critical mind as well. And this is what we do with our partners. We work with young people. There is an equality space to fight discrimination and to deconstruct prejudices. There are places where people can get familiar with digital citizenship, And for that, we need journalists and the media to help us to be very active. It's essential if we want democracy to thrive. Thank you. I'm a journalist. I work a lot on Europe and information about Europe in Nancy, here in Strasbourg, with Arte. There's a lot that is being done to provide good, reliable information. Thank you again. Thank you to all the partners that have helped us to organize the forum. Thank you very much. A round of applause for them. Thank you for welcoming us to your city and to your region.
To thank all the organizing partners of the World Forum for Democracy for sharing their insights with us about democracy and its role in safeguarding our freedoms. New people are coming all the time, and also for people who have started watching us on the streaming, let me just remind you, you have the QR codes in front of you. They represent the first possibility for you to contribute to the general discussion about the new democratic pact for Europe. You will be able to talk, as those who've been to the forum know. We do take questions after the introductory sessions. The new democratic pact for Europe is a strategic and political process. Its ultimate goal is to secure the Europe of 46 countries where democracy works better, reaches further and includes everyone. So we really would like you to invest a little time into responding to the questions that you find on the QR code, as this too will bring us all closer to that goal. So, ladies and gentlemen, this edition of the World Forum is, among other things, dedicated to that part of the human experience where culture and democracy meet, as we've been hearing this morning. Music is also a very important way of expressing our thoughts and emotions since time immemorial. In a few moments, once our technical staff have set up the microphone, is it ready? Can we go? Yes, perfect. I think we're almost ready to receive them. We're absolutely delighted, and I know you're going to give a huge round of applause to enjoy the mastery of Bogdana Piwnienko from Ukraine, who I'll ask you to applaud. First of all, straight away, she's waiting to come on in the stage. A big round of applause. And I'm just waiting for our technical friends to tell me that everything is okay. Can we ask her to come down? Yes, perfect. So here we are. We're delighted to have with you Bogdana Piwnienko from Ukraine. I'll leave it to you to play some music. Thank you so much for being here with us.
Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to introduce music, what I would like to perform for you today. This music has become a symbol of our fight of Ukraine for our freedom, for the values this council was built to protect, democracy and human rights. But most of all, the fight for our identity. Melody by Miroslav Skorik, Voice of Soul of Ukraine.
Thank you very much indeed. That was Bogdana Pivnienko from Ukraine. Thank you so much for having come here today. Now, as we've been discussing, democratic backsliding, disinformation, impunity and authoritarianism are altogether undermining democracy throughout Europe. People are increasingly afraid and frustrated. A collective response is needed. With the new democratic pact, the Council of Europe unites with its partners to boost solutions that work and create new responses. Let us please welcome to address these different issues the Secretary General of the Council of Europe himself, Alain Berset. Merci de l'accueillir. Thank you for welcoming him. Thank you.
Minister Attard, Ministers, President Rossopoulos, dear Theodoros, Madame la Maire, dear Jeanne Barsegan, representatives of the French government, Région Grand Est and Collectivité Européenne d'Alsace, dear participants. Yesterday, it was reminded earlier, yesterday marked 75 years of the European Convention on Human Rights. A reminder of what our parents and grandparents built. But now we know it. Their world is almost gone. And the new order is still waiting to be imagined. More and more voices are saying democracy is too slow, or things are too complicated, or maybe it's time for someone to take control. But the real danger is not confusion. The real danger is simplification. We must resist these easy answers. Our time demands something more difficult. Un éloge de la complexité. The courage to think in complexity. The discipline to act with clarity. And the wisdom to speak to everyone, not just those who agree. We are living between worlds. Previous generations built an order to keep peace. And now we must build one to keep democracy, by making democracy the center of gravity for security, for accountability, and for solidarity. Let us start with security. For many, it is synonymous with rearmament. More than 800 billion euros in new defense spending are now planned. As defense budgets are expected to soar, trust in democracy continues to fall. We could soon have stronger armies, but weaker democracies. Fast forward 5 or 10 years. What happens in these conditions? Stronger armies but weaker democracies. What happens in 5 or 10 years if an extremist movement gains power in one of these heavily armed states? What would they do with those weapons? And against whom? As we know, more than a century separates the Chemin des Dames from the Battle of Bakhmut. Yet, the same trenches, the same suffering, the same danger for democracy. At the same time, another war unfolds. Silent, borderless, invisible. A contest for how and what we think. Disinformation is its weapon. Its strategy, influence. Its target, democracy itself. Militarization, disinformation, and AI test our institutions. and our capacity to act in time. And they force us to rethink what we mean, what we exactly mean by democracy, by security. And the last century proved that when democracies disarm, they become targets. And this century warns that when they arm without accountability, those arms can be turned inward, to crush dissent, to subvert institutions, and to place power above law. That is why the Council of Europe is setting new guardrails. A framework convention on artificial intelligence, and work now on a new convention on disinformation and foreign interference. Because real security means institutions. Real security means institutions people trust, laws that apply equally, and the kind of stability that lets democracy grow. That is democratic security. That is democratic security, and it is the first line of defense for Europe. That is where, to come to the second point, that is where the question of accountability comes in. To guard against the illusion that strength alone can replace legitimacy. And Ukraine reminds us why every day. Each time it is attacked for choosing democracy, for choosing freedom, and for choosing the right to decide its own future. Accountability, as you know, in Ukraine, accountability in Ukraine takes many forms. The Register of Damage and the Future Claims Commission, the work toward a special tribunal for the crime of aggression, and the European Court of Human Rights, the only international court hearing human rights cases linked to this war. And together, they ensure that every loss is recorded, every claim is addressed, and every crime judged. But Ukraine's reconstruction will demand more than rebuilding cities. It will mean rebuilding trust through justice, reform, and the rule of law. All of this lies at the heart of our action plan, the action plan from the Council of Europe for Ukraine. Across Europe, corruption and political interference undermine trust just as surely as bombs destroy buildings. Justice depends on independence. Integrity must be the backbone of our new democratic order. I mentioned at the very beginning security, accountability, and solidarity. So let us turn to solidarity. It is a measure of how democracy protects the most vulnerable, women, children, minorities, migrants, and others. And for many of them, safety and equality remain out of reach. At a time when some question the principles of the European Convention on Human Rights, it reminds us that democracy's strength lies not in avoiding complexity, but in confronting it. That is precisely what we are doing by creating space for dialogue on migration, to take this example. But solidarity must go further still. It must extend to future generations in how we face climate change and the inequalities it leaves behind. And it must speak to those who see inflation and the cost of living as the most urgent democratic priority in their daily lives. As rearmament grows, the sacrifices it requires will deepen economic strain, and with it, the risk of feeding more distrust in democracy. And solidarity is what holds us together. And this brings me to the next point I want to try to address with you this morning: cooperation. Democracy is universal. Our values do not end at borders. The Council of Europe was never just about lines on a map. If Europe is to matter, it must stand where its values are at stake, and do so without double standards. Across the world, a new transactionalism is taking hold, where, everything becomes deal, even peace. But democracy is not another transaction. No one can hijack democracy. As global multilateralism is struggling, multilateral regional organizations can help unlock solutions. And this is central to our new external action strategy, to connect regions, to share standards and rebuild trust through law and rights. At the United Nations General Assembly in last September, the African Union, the Organization of American States, and the League of Arab States all expressed strong interest in deepening that dialogue with the Council of Europe and with us. And this is why this forum is so important, because democracy's future will not be written by one region, or by one generation, or by one organization. And this is the spirit of the new Democratic Pact for Europe. We are doing our part. A collective effort led by the Council of Europe to address disinformation, to address foreign interference, to address democratic backsliding, to address climate crisis, everything that weakens our democracies. And at its center, one question: how must democracy evolve to meet the technological and geopolitical shifts of our time? And one goal: to renew the foundations of our democratic life. And three pillars: education, to nurture democratic culture; protection, to reinforce democracy wherever it is in retreat; and innovation. The first pillar is innovation, to adapt our institutions to fast-moving, cross-border hybrid threats. Across Europe, the conversation has begun, and ideas are already emerging. And this forum, exactly this forum, is part of that journey. And the window for action is closing fast, as we know. Some say democracy is dying. But what if it is only beginning? In the long story of humankind, freedom is still new. Still new. For centuries, power served the few: emperors, pharaohs, kings, and ideologies. And only recently, in the history of humankind, only recently did people begin to govern themselves. And each generation has had to learn what democracy means in its own time. And the task before us is exactly this. The task before us is to find strength without losing restraint, to face division without feeding it. And it is to defend ourselves without becoming what we fear. Our democratic future will be written in classrooms, in newsrooms, in courts, in the daily choices of citizens who choose hope over cynicism. And if democracy is to remain the center of gravity of the order we are building, we must take the long view and make decisions that will still stand in 1 year, in 5 years, in 10 years, in 15 years, in 25 years, 1 generation, and more. So I wish you really fruitful discussions, engagement this week here in Strasbourg, this forum, World Forum for Democracy. Let us do this together, and thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much indeed, Secretary General. Merci, Monsieur le Secrétaire Général. So as we begin this morning, this World Forum for Democracy, we take the opportunity to recall that this event is enriched by respecting everybody's freedom of expression, opinion, and belief. In further respecting the code of conduct for this event, you will help ensure that it is a constructive and positive contribution to a better future, a better democracy, and to truly embracing democratic culture in practice. You will have been able to see the text earlier on the screens. It's also posted on the forum website. The reporting from the event will be supported by AI. The event, as I said earlier, is being live streamed, and a deferred transmission will remain available on the webpage of the World Forum for Democracy. Obviously, everything is translated into English and French, the official languages of the Council of Europe. So once again, thank you very much to the Secretary General. Now, we're going to have another very important roundtable discussion about what we've been talking about, the role of journalists. I am one myself, so I can see how things have changed. I became a journalist 45 years ago. The whole situation now is totally different. Quality journalism is key to a resilient democracy, driving pluralism, public engagement and informed debate. But today, as we've been hearing, everything is under threat from authoritarian pressure, AI-driven manipulation, and the profit models that reward division, the algorithms, as I'm sure you know. This session explores how to support quality journalism and reform media governance so that we can all better promote trustworthy information, inclusive participation, and stronger, more cohesive democracies. Now, as always, this session will be in both languages, in French and English, and I'm delighted to hand over to the moderator, who's the Deputy Advocacy Director of the Committee to Protect Journalists in Belgium, Tom Gibson. So ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the panelists of the first plenary session. Thank you very much indeed.
Good morning. We're going to allow everyone to get seated. Welcome to today's first panel, entitled, How is the Transformation of Media Impacting Democracy? Quality journalism is key to resilient democracy, driving pluralism, public engagement, and informed debate. But today, it's under threat from authoritarian pressure, AI-driven manipulation, and profit models that reward division. Look everywhere. Media pluralism and independence are under attack. Trust in the media is scarily low. Media consumption patterns are changing quickly. Big tech has huge power. Independent journalists at the same time are under a complex range of judicial, psychological, physical, or economic threats or pressures. And the impact is a changing discourse influencing democratic processes and society's ability to hold power to account. This session explores how to support journalism, promote access to information, and inclusive participation for stronger democracies. And this morning, our panel of experts, they're going to be guiding us through this and looking at approaches or solutions for how to address these issues. To the furthest to my right is Dr. Akihiko Tanaka, President of the Japan International Cooperation Agency. Prior to this, his roles have included president of the National Graduate Institute for Policy Studies and professor of international politics, as well as executive vice president at the University of Tokyo. To his left is Dr. Gayatri Venkataswaran, who teaches and researches on media and politics at the University of Nottingham, Malaysia. She has over 25 years of experience in journalism, media freedom advocacy in Malaysia and Southeast Asia. To her left is David Kaye, professor of law at the University of California, Irvine. From 2014 to 2020, he served as UN Special Rapporteur on the freedom of opinion and expression and is presently the US member on the Venice Commission of the Council of Europe. And immediately to my right is Davina Frau-Meggs, who is Professor of Communication and Information Sciences at the Sorbonne Nouvelle University. She is a specialist in media and information literacy, for which she holds a UNESCO chair entitled Becoming in the Era of Sustainable Digital Development. And Davina is also the founder and president of Savoir Devenir, an NGO dedicated to digital citizenship democracy. So let's move immediately to the opening presentations of how the transformation of the media is impacting democracy. And first, I would like to welcome Dr. Tanaka, President of the Japan International Cooperation Agency, to take the floor. Dr. Tanaka, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you. Is it on? Okay. Thank you very much. It's my pleasure to participate in this great forum. I believe that journalism is a very, very important element to strengthen democracy. But before talking about democracy, as somebody who has been watching political situations around the world, particularly the developing world, I would like to mention the resilience of democracies around the world, despite the fact that overall there may be, according to many research institutions, that decline in liberal values around the world. Over the past year, as I observed the political situations around the world, there are certain cases where democratic institutions has shown resilience. The first, without being complacent, I would like to point out some cases. The one case is South Korea, where last December, the president tried to introduce the martial law. And then the parliament stopped him and have him withdraw martial law. And then after that, parliament impeached him, and the constitutional court supported the parliamentary decision. And then in the spring, there was a presidential election, which was conducted peacefully and fairly, and the new government was formed. And this is the first case. And then second case that I have in mind is the case of Senegal. The former president tried to postpone the elections last spring. And then again, the court in Senegal, with the backing of free journalism, ordered to conduct an election on schedule. And the election was conducted freely and fairly, and the new government and President Bashir Diomaye Faye was formed. And then the following parliamentary election was also conducted successfully, and Senegal now is a fairly stable democratic government. And the third case is Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka defaulted in 2022, and then president was expelled from the country, and then the country was in the tentative government. And then finally this year, there was a presidential election. Again, the presidential election was conducted peacefully and fairly and the opposition leader took power. And then the following parliamentary election was conducted also free and fairly. And again, Sri Lanka is now under a fairly stable democratic government. And then the fourth example that I have in mind is the case of Malawi, one of the poorest countries in the world. But then in recent presidential election, the opposition party won the election, and the then incumbent president, President Chakwera, conceded his defeat, and the power was transferred peacefully. And so there are certain elements that we feel that democratic institutions have resilience. And the elements that produce this resilience is, one is the freedom of speech, and then second is the independent judiciary. And so with these functioning journalism and this functioning judiciary, we could expect that democratic institutions have certain strength to withstand. But then, having said, I believe the role of journalism is something we should not emphasize more. And then particularly, currently, as was discussed previously, the traditional journalism is being challenged by the rise of social media and digitalized form of opinion making and formulation of the new thinking. I believe the coming of social media has both positive and probably the negative impact on the democratic institutions. Positive side would encourage those who have not been included in the traditional political process to raise voices. But then on the other hand, the social media could probably increase the division and promote more extreme views. And in that respect, I think the role of traditional media to provide accurate information and then present more constructive forum is important. I think these themes will be discussed in detail from our other panelists. I would like to stop here.
Thank you very much, Dr. Tanaka, by opening up and reinforcing the role of journalism, and also that we have these two factors in play. We have both a free press, but also the independence of the judiciary, and they're mutually supporting. Gayatri, we touched on big tech, but I think you can talk us through how big tech is contributing to the shaping of democratic values in Southeast Asia.
Thanks, Tom. Bonjour, good afternoon, everyone. So I'll talk about the context of Southeast Asia, where I have worked both as a journalist as well as an advocate for media freedom and freedom of expression. And I think a little bit of a historical journey might be useful. It is a region that has a long time mistrust in terms of traditional or legacy media because of the high political controls that we have seen in authoritarian as well as semi-authoritarian regimes, countries in the region. So trust towards the news media has been low for a long time. And as such, we have had a long time experience as well with alternative tools and spaces. So when we talk about, the role of big tech today, I think we need to look back a little bit at how civil society, communities that have been marginalized or deprived of voices, political opponents have always explored alternative methods of communication, alternative methods of mobilization. And I think that is really crucial to keep in mind as we look at what is happening in today's scenario. We have had experiences of empowerment, of expanding those spaces, but at the same time responses by state and state actors or state-linked actors in repressing those spaces. And we've had that tension for quite a while now. And so I'm going to use the metaphor of the canaries again. I think it'll be the third time, so apologies for that. But I do think that that has been, or at least the experience of Southeast Asia, civil society in terms of voices coming out, as well as much in the global south, should have been the canary in the coal mine for what is actually happening in what we call the established democracies today. In experiences with big tech today is that it has not actually bypassed power in terms of structures of power. It has replaced the new forms of power. So in today's experience of political building, in terms of expression, we are seeing that the big tech companies, like much of the large media corporations of the past, becoming the sources of power. So decisions are being made by Silicon Valley, those in Silicon Valley, in Dublin, for example, where many of these are also registered, in terms of moderation of content, takedown of content, that used to be the monopoly of states. And so states today actually have somewhat also outsourced the roles of, of moderating opinions, and as such is today actually the main sources of power. So it is somewhat of a paradox that we do have technologies that have empowered, that continue to empower, and I think that is really important. I think we do need to start off at a point where we're not demonizing technology as something that we need to confront, but to see where the potentials have been there. But at the same time to see the connections, the tensions, the contradictions that exist because big tech is now also in the mix of decision making. So I think that is quite important in terms of how civil society actors, the media, alternative media have been contesting these spaces. And I think that some of the benefits that Prof has also talked about in terms of allowing these spaces are really important groups that tend to be excluded. And these could be women's groups, indigenous communities, again, political dissent, have been able to use these spaces largely to voice out, to increase visibility or create visibility, and also to engage. So another layer of problem that comes with the big tech is that we are also seeing the disappearances of accountability mechanisms. So what used to be holding political institutions accountable, where there are existing mechanisms that are created by democratic systems, or at least semi-democratic systems, those are now invisible today, or at least are not available for civil society, for society in Southeast Asia to engage with. So for example, it is impossible for us to engage with some of these big corporations because we are not a key market for these companies. So the rules of corporatization ignore quite a vast amount of population around the world, and there are no accountability mechanisms that directly reach out and respond to, whether it's journalists who are using the spaces, it's activists who are using the spaces that are not able to actually seek accountability. So these are some of the things that we're already seeing in Southeast Asia, and I think that we are seeing new forms of, this is neoliberalism at work, in terms of how it's regulating spaces. Freedom of speech is important, but it is a new form of authoritarianism in that sense. So maybe I'll stop there just to allow for more questions also.
Thank you. And we're going to have discussion because what we need to be asking is how we can improve that transparency, the due diligence, the remedy from the platforms, and how we as civil society can be mobilizing. But there's a compounded element, David, isn't there, around media capture. And increasingly what we're seeing is that influence limiting independent journalism. Can you talk us through it?
Sure. I think this is working. First of all, thank you for moderating. Thanks to the sponsors for inviting me. Thanks to having me follow Gayatri, who's a longtime friend. So I want to make 3 points, and I'll try to make them relatively quickly. The first point is something that I just want us to reflect on, given the fact that we are really at the 75th anniversary of the adoption of the European Convention on Human Rights. So actually, before we get to media, I want to start with law, and to remind everybody of the meaning of freedom of speech, of freedom of expression. It's very common to think about freedom of speech as the right of a speaker to to speak, to impart information, to be a voice, and that is absolutely the case. That's absolutely essential. But I want to remind everybody I won't quote the European Convention, Article 10, but I'll quote Article 19 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which provides that everyone is guaranteed the right to seek, receive, and impart information and ideas of all kinds, regardless of frontiers. And the reason I mention that is because freedom of expression, freedom of speech is not only about the person who's imparting, it's also about the right of everyone to seek and receive information. And that means that government not only has an obligation to avoid interfering with that right, but also has a positive obligation to create the environment in which we can enjoy experiencing freedom of expression. So I just want to put us on that grounding first. The second point that I want to make is related to essentially the kind of state behavior that we're seeing globally right now. And by referencing state behavior, I'm not thinking just about one state, although given my accent, you might know what state I have in mind. But we see states consistently manipulating media, using the tools of media, not only legacy media, but also social media, in order to promote propaganda, disinformation, and also to use their own tools of censorship. There's this real nefarious combination of propaganda and censorship that has descended on our democracies. And on the one hand, I think we can look at the states and say, look, you governments, you have an obligation not to interfere with freedom of expression, but also to create that space for it. But at the same time, media needs to be in a position to reflect what is actually happening in the world, what governments are actually doing. And I think one of the things that we're seeing, in part due to state intimidation, is a pretty consistent failure of, let's say at least legacy media or mainstream media to stand up to that propaganda and to call it out for what it is. And we've had a pretty widespread failure across democracies to do that. And I think we should be honest about our expectations for independent media to reflect that kind of reality. And then the last point that I want to make is about public media. So public media often gets kind of marginalized in these discussions, but in many democracies, and certainly in strong democracies, you also have a very vibrant public media space. And by public media, I mean public media that is supported by government, by our tax dollars. And again, in democracy after democracy, we see not only a reduction in funding of public media, but we also see a denigration of public media. And public media, frankly, is one of the key sources for people, not just in cities, but across countries, to get access to information. So with those three, I really just want to conclude with a couple of quick thoughts in terms of proposals, which we'll get to, I think, in Q&A. But the first proposal I would have is that we all need to double down on the state's positive obligation around freedom of expression. So again, not just criticizing censorship, but also demanding an investment in an environment that is fruitful for and positive for freedom of expression. That means using the tools of competition policy. It means the European Union not backing down on the enforcement of the Digital Services Act or the Digital Markets Act and things like that. And the second, where I'll conclude, is that we in civil society need to be thinking about whether we are overly reliant on the existing media channels and whether we should really be thinking about, and I think some of this we saw in the US elections last night, particularly in the mayoral race in New York City. We need to be thinking about creating our own channels of communication in order to reach people, and actually asking ourselves whether we're doing a good enough job in reaching people on some of these fundamental rights issues. Thanks, Tom.
Thank you very much. There's a lot to go off there, including trying to reframe the human, well, not trying to reframe, just trying to get the human rights argument into people's heads and on their desks. And we do need to be thinking about practical solutions. And Davina, I think one of these practical solutions that you're going to talk us through is media and information literacy. Can it provide answers, and how?
Thank you, Tom. I'm very happy to be here, especially the Council of Europe that has been spearheading a lot of thinking about all these issues. Je vais parler en français maintenant.
Now I'm going to switch to French. So this is the European Year of Digital Citizenship. And the Council of Europe, I have to say, has played a very innovative role. It's continuing to be innovative here. It's being innovative with regard to media and information literacy. And what I would like to say is that what we need to save with regard to our democracies is some information, not the media. I'm just trying to be a bit provocative before the lunch break, because information is basically something that we take for granted. This having been said, things have changed hugely ever since the arrival of the digital world. Let me just take you for a walk through what's changed and what's become more complex, because when we talk about information, there's three different things that this relates to, but we rarely think of them all together. Information today is mostly data, basically, digital data. And digital data is not data as such. Data has become something that's active, assets, if you like, that you trade on the stock exchange, that you purchase and that you sell. And this has become things that can be used to influence elections, for instance, to keep tabs on the choices that voters are going to be making. They become vectors, if you like, vectors for intelligence, and they can find out so much about us and our patterns and habits. So data is not as straightforward as that, if you like. But information is also what we used to call documents back in the time, docs, for instance. All these files that we are so used to working with, including with ChatGPT, artificial intelligence. Now, these docs, first and foremost, are archives. And this is where we can find authentic sources of information. And currently speaking, this is perhaps the one thing that's mainly being attacked and not being looked at enough, and it's being attacked by deepfakes and information. My third point is, of course, the media. But first and foremost, and in particular for the young people, the social media. In other words, for the young generation, what we refer to as legacy media. I hate the term legacy media because I think the legacy media is not all that bad. But media is basically echo chambers in which, rather than simply exchanging and sharing views, you're simply sharing views with like-minded people in a very polarized environment. And they, if you like, are setting the agenda for the mass media. And they are therefore setting the agenda with regard to the importance of information that's being imparted. So that's the whole scale of journalism. Journalism no longer has a monopoly, and it no longer sets the agenda. That's how things have changed. Now, once you've said that, well, you need to start mourning, of course. But this is what creates democracy. It's as a result of this that people are forming their own opinion. It's a result of information that people form opinion. It's not the other way around. It's not the opinion that creates information, and it's the other way around. And if this is the case, then what we need to do, we need to accept facts. We need to accept the fact that journalism has to change. It needs to reinvent itself. We need to go out to where young people are creating their information, sources that we pour scorn on because we say, well, they're not very well-informed sources, or that they're not objective, they're not independent, as a quality journalism should be. But this sort of quality journalism is no longer as important as it was before, because let's not forget that there are cyber digital platforms that are increasing in importance, and they're all run by men machos, and they're authoritarian, and they're anti-democratic, and they're using the capacity of data and archives and docs, which is, of course, cross-border. So within all this, what's happening with democracy? And what should democracy do? Well, in Europe, it's not doing all that badly. I'm going to be optimistic today. With regard to data, we have the European Union data regulation. And it's quite a strong regulation. Now, artificial intelligence tries not to respect it, but we can still have LLM and search engines that respect this in artificial intelligence. I can give you names of these later on, if you're interested. With regard to the media, we have directives, and a recent one in particular, on defending press freedom and media freedom. And with regard to docs, what do we have? Well, we have DSA, and we have the AI Act, and this will preserve the integrity of our documents. So our democracies, certainly in Europe, have developed tools. They need to be coordinated tools. They need to be part of a package, which is quite an interesting one. But this set of tools needs to be used by the young generation. They need to be able to call on accountability. And for this, we need to have media literacy throughout Europe, throughout the world. And this has become a cross-cutting skill that's acknowledged in text, it's acknowledged in reality, and it's 2 or 4 hours of teaching per year in schools, even including in countries such as France. Well, it is part of school programs. There's a huge difference between the tools that I was talking to you about and other colleagues have mentioned, and what exactly is happening out on the front line. And the main risk that we are facing today is that we won't be able to pass on to our young generation the importance of information and a love for information, which will create a love for democracy and a love for journalism. And I think this is what will enable us to continue to innovate and to prolong what we think is of huge importance, that is to be able to create information sharing and to make headway and to understand each other.
Very much, and enormous work to be done there. And I think there's also a very interesting discussion there to be had in terms of the linkages between your work and other civil society groups, press freedom groups, freedom of expression groups. But I want to move on to the discussion that we're going to have. We are going to have discussion first, and then we're going to be taking questions from the audience. So my first question for the panel is, this year we are watching a clear weakening of the international rules-based order and a rise of transactional politics. Multilateral institutions like the Council of Europe, ASEAN, the UN, the OSCE, the EU, and other bodies need to strengthen their support to democracy by safeguarding the space for journalists and journalism. Do we think they're up to the challenge? What current weaknesses need to be prioritized for repair? Now, Dr. Tanaka, would you like to start us off?
Well, thank you very much. I agree that there are strong elements of transactionalism in international relations in recent years, and it seems that everything is reduced to give and take on a single issue basis, and then particularly if it involves violence, then that's going to be exchanges of brute force rather than persuasion, and this creates, I think, difficult a path for responsible and quality journalism. But I think this was mentioned by the previous keynote speeches, but the role of media, or the traditional media, or responsible state, is that the world is consisting of complex reality rather than simple reality. And resolving everything in a bilateral give and takes may not produce good results to complex issues. you know, we are surrounded by social systems interactions, but we are also surrounded by living system, ecosystem interaction, and we are surrounded by the physical interaction, including climate change. All these issues are complexly interrelated. And then if you insist that there is a simple solution to every issue, that's totally mistaken. And I believe in order to restore multilateral efforts to preserve the rule of law and openness and freedom, I think the media has to emphasize the aspects of complexity rather than the existence or the possibility of having simple solutions. Of course, the geopolitics is influenced by major actors in international politics. It may not be able to persuade those who are believing in the value of transactionalism, but I think among the countries that believe in the values of multilateralism, we may be able to preserve what I might call the sphere of cooperation. Keeping the important items on the global agenda, so that we would like to maintain the area of freer trade as large as possible, areas of rule of law as large as possible, and areas of development cooperation as large as possible. And then I think we would like our journalists to provide accurate information, and then of course, the state, which controls the public media, has to create an environment where citizens will receive accurate information. And also, I think the role of the private sector business, who sponsor all these social media activities, to be very responsible for creating the environment where all important issues are discussed in a responsible manner.
Gayatri.
So a couple of things to respond to. So we have the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, which recently just had Timor-Leste join as the 11th member, and which just concluded its summit, welcoming, much to the opposition of a lot of the civil society and publics in general, the President of the United States, which has pretty much imposed tariffs on everybody, which has pulled out much of the aid that has assisted civil society working on independent media, media literacy, civil society, working on democratic reforms. So the societies that have been largely impacted also by decisions that have been made by the new US government. And so there was a lot of issues that people felt, we need to make a political statement in terms of how the US has impacted on a lot of these areas. But it was a very much of a transactional, again, a very transactional relationship, because everyone had their vested interest in terms of the trade negotiations. Trade negotiations that would have benefited, again, corporate sectors rather than actual issues of poverty, issues of inequalities, issues of political expression as well. So that's first. ASEAN, with the principles of non-interference within the region, has been a problematic issue. And so we have had the absence of major conflict rather than establishing peace in the region. So we are very agreeable towards each other that we'll try to avoid as much as possible, even though we do have, in most recent being between Cambodia and Thailand, but we try to avoid as much as we can, rather than pursuing peace in its truer sense. So we have non-interference. There's a huge gap between government-to-government relations and people-to-people relations. And so there's a lot of aspirations for the kind of democratic movement, wanting the kind of empowerment versus state interest that is very much pro-corporate, very much pro. So while I'm talking about big tech as a problem, it's very much welcomed by the states because it's seen as sources of investment, jobs, even though the data shows completely the opposite. So we try to stay out of each other's problems, but the thing that we agree on is that at the ASEAN level, they're very busy working on coming up with policies and guidelines targeting the big tech while wanting their money. So it's a very, very contradictory and again, very complex. It's not simple at all. So they're developing all this task force and guidelines on social media harms, on fake news, on AI. These are the top 3 things that they're talking about to try and combat things like fraud, financial deception, financial manipulation, violence online, gender-based violence online. These are real and serious problems, but where the direction of a lot of these policies are to curtail political dissent at the heart of it, and where big tech actually works with them quite well. To serve that purposes. They have yet to respond positively in terms of the kinds of deception, violence online. So it's again a very weird relationship. But if I can just now segue to look at what is the relevance of the Council of Europe, the relevance of European instruments of human rights. So these countries do look upon examples from Europe. So for example, the Digital Signature Act, and want to adopt because they see the lure of being able to control the social media companies or the big tech. But what is missing within the framework of ASEAN, even though we have an ASEAN Human Rights Declaration, is that there are no sufficient guardrails protecting fundamental rights. And so we want to adopt the regulations that have been developed elsewhere without offering the kinds of protection that should be there to sort of make sure that there's no abuses of power. And so there are opportunities, I think. So when we talk about multilateralism, it's a huge question mark within ASEAN in terms of how much faith we have in ASEAN. But there are opportunities for the engagement between ASEAN states and EU, for example, or the Council of Europe through different platforms. And I think these need to be addressed. And I think there are opportunities for our colleagues in Europe to raise these questions as well to ASEAN representatives in terms of regulations that would first have to address issues of fundamental human rights. And I think missing or absent those kinds of rights is very difficult, or it is impossible to have that ability to compensate for those who are seeking remedies and justice, especially where a lot of these abuses are happening online. So I think those are some of the ways in which we see multilateralism. We see our friends in Africa across the, having some workable mechanisms, and we want to have the same thing as well. But reality is slightly a different story. Thanks.
Thank you. David, you wanted to jump in. I mean, one question I have to you is how you see things, how far things have slipped since you were the special rapporteur, and whether or not it would be more difficult now to do that job. I know that you may not be able to say that, but I think that's an interesting question. And you can also talk about both Europe and the US, which are sort of major to this argument, aren't they?
Sure. Correlation or causation is... Well, anyway, let me try to answer the question, again, making 3 points. As, I don't know, a professor of mine in college said everything should be in 3 points, so I'm going to do that, continue with that. So first on international institutions, I mean, they're clearly failing. I mean, anybody who can open their eyes and look around sees that the work is good, but it's not translating into democratic outcomes around the world, and we have to ask ourselves why that is. Like, what's the break between, paced resolutions and the actual, effect of or effective democracies that we have in Europe or in North America? So something's missing there. And so the first point that I want to make is, and this is really as much for media as for anybody else, is there's just not enough coverage of what happens in international institutions. These institutions are very distant from the lived lives of people. And part of that is, frankly, our fault. I mean, it's the fault of media to a certain extent by failing to provide the resources to cover what goes on in Strasbourg or Brussels or in New York or Geneva and so on. So that, I think, needs to change. There needs to be more of a focus to show this is what's happening in these institutions, and this is why it's important. The second problem with international institutions, again, this might not be per se the institutions, but it's about that translation. I think of it as domestication of international norms into domestic environments. We just don't see those easy pathways from what happens in the General Assembly or in PACE or in other institutions, and just see the law changing or the policy changing. Why is that? I think we need to really drill down, understand what's going on there. And then the third point, I'm going to make a defense of simplicity. I mean, there's so much, and we're all academics, and so we kind of trade in complexity, so I'm sort of going against interest here. But there's some things that certainly, some solutions really are going to be complex, but some factors in the world around us are not complex. I mean, there is value in, and this is, again, for media reporting, there's value in simplicity, right? So what are the simple things around us? Violence, especially violence against women. I mean, there's nothing complex about that, and even if we look at root causes, we know that accountability for violence is essential. If we think about corruption, again, we don't need real complex explanations for greed, which is just a fundamental human sin. I don't want to go down the path of talking about sin, but we see corruption, it's not that complex. Or finally, just to mention discrimination. Discrimination against those who are vulnerable, discrimination against minorities, discrimination against women, failure to recognize the rights of children as opposed to the rights of parents. I mean, there's a whole range of things that we could be talking about that, yes, there's a level of complexity in thinking about solutions, but identifying the problems really doesn't require all that much.
Oui, et c'est vrai que pour identifier.
Yes, it's true. To identify problems, the best solution that we found in Europe, or perhaps at the UN also, is to opt for multilateralism and multiple stakeholdership. Around the table, you need to make sure that you have academics, researchers, because they will provide important elements, and then civil society, associations representing various groups, communities, minorities. My example would be the one that we experimented in Europe with the Commission Task Force on online disinformation, when we were faced at the time with a quite novel phenomenon, with electoral interference, systematic disinformation, with a state which was at cyber war when we weren't really aware of it, but we now know it's very true, way beyond gender issues, but it is also a major issue. So the idea was to bring to the table, to understand the phenomenon, academics, civil society, journalists, the platforms, and governments. Platforms have to be there. And Europe can do it because we're a market to platforms. It's very cynical, but that's the way it is. In other regions, it's not necessarily a very interesting market for platforms. So we imposed a number of things which are interesting. Moderating, and we need to keep the pressure up. Although with Donald Trump's election, they turned their coats. But you can use one platform against another. And then fact-checking was introduced, which is a pillar of journalism, verifying your sources, not done necessarily only by journalists, by outside entities, can come as a support of fact-checkers, developers, academics. Fact-checking has become the pillar of resilience, and media literacy, media education, which creates resilience as well. With these achievements, we now have the observatory in Europe, where work is done on education, on fact-checking, good practices are being exchanged, research work, Horizon, Creative Europe, programs that look at the upstream data, education, journalism. So in this way, we created a space in Europe, Brussels and Strasbourg, where things are being done with everyone at the table. And then you can talk to other regions. With my association, I'm very present in Africa and Latin America. And we share good practices, and we need to keep it up all together around the table. And then perhaps try and impress on policy deciders what we need, what we expect, what we want, what we're ready to give up as humans, and what we absolutely need to keep. Freedom of expression, obviously, is one of them.
I want to touch on a couple of elements that you mentioned. One of them was the bringing together people and bringing the platforms and creating this engagement with the platforms. But in your presentation, David, you've also touched on this question of media capture. We're dealing as a press freedom community in our defense of independent journalism with harmful effects. And we have to resist this power of big tech and of the oligarchs. These are major challenges. And I really want the panelists to be honest now. Are we as civil society and academia, are we well coordinated enough? You've mentioned this exchange, but what more could we do, given your professional experience? What more could we do now? What needs to change? And also bearing in mind, we've got 10 minutes before we go to questions, so watch the clock.
Well, thank you very much. Well, first of all, I agree on the simple messages on important human rights. I think they are very, straightforward, and we need to keep sending those straightforward messages. But it is reality that there are those who don't listen to those messages. And then particularly those transactionalist, efforts in the world don't listen to those simple messages. And to realize simple message, I believe you need to do a lot of complex efforts, mobilizing all sorts of stakeholders so that those things could happen. And then as somebody working on development cooperation, this is very difficult in certain countries where authoritarian rules are there or semi-authoritarian rules are there. And then you need to, figure out how to somehow affect the society as a large to move toward those simple and straightforward protection of human rights. And in the meantime, as I said at the outset, there are cases of positive movements in the developing world, where even one of the most poorest countries like Malawi preserving the essential elements of democracy. And I think what we need to do is those in the global south, let's say, which are trying to preserve the essential elements of human rights as well as the essential elements of free and open international order, to get together to preserve those sphere of cooperation. And then I think, given the United States decision to decline the large elements of development cooperation, the fund to those civil society organizations or NGOs who are trying work hard to preserve essential elements of human rights, they have difficulty in keep working. And I don't believe that no other countries can, make up for the loss that the US declined. But I think there should be certain qualitative approaches, even if we may not be able to come up with the amount of fund that the USAID has contributed, but there may be ways of connecting all these efforts so that they could improve the conditions of both political rights as well as social economic rights.
So a few years ago, we were talking about the post-truth. I think what we want to move forward thinking is post-platform, because I fear the day, and we talked about it, that it's not an if, it's a when. The likes of Mark Zuckerberg and Elon Musk decide they're going to take their platform completely in a different direction, behind subscription, on a full scale, or, change the model or ditch it completely because other projects have come to replace it. Where will the communities go? Where will the users go who have used these spaces for, the kind of democratic reforms, movements, independence, things like that. So where do we go when the billionaires decide that's not what they want to do anymore and, don't want it? So I think we need to think about a post-platform era. I think our role as academics and advocates in our own constituencies, we need to think about also forms of accountability that are centering communities rather than a top-down model of accountability. So I think we need to explore accountability mechanisms that are from the top towards the people, right? So with this together, thinking about, again, where we can support, new forms of community journalism or information production, so to address the question of information asymmetry. So I think that would be one of the directions that, it is possible. It will take a long time, as we have taken a long time to address so many other challenges as well. And I think that is something that if we can invest resources into or conversations to mainstream this, that would be my suggestion. And I think also it's about thinking that today's era of a challenge is about a lot of extractions that continue, platforms, companies, corporations that extract data resources from the South still, that is supporting their businesses. And I think those are the kinds of conversations that we need to mainstream, shifting it from how do we defend the spaces to say, what are new spaces we need to create as well, because it needs to de-link itself from the kind of corporate control, and thinking about centering communities in the forms of accountability so that it's not about corporates responding to the state, but it's actually responding to people in that sense. Yeah, thank you.
Oui. On va casser le rythme.
I'll change the rhythm, but what I meant to say is that I don't necessarily think that we need to move to the post-platform era, but create alternative platforms, media platforms, the European platform of public broadcasters. Schools could become platforms. In France, for instance, the school is a 12 million people platform. Not so bad in terms of numbers of followers, but decision makers right now don't think digital because they're not trained to the digital world. They simply don't see that the future generation is the Gen Z, born into the digital world with no other reference. They don't know about the media of a gone-by world, and they distrust politicians, their age, their power. What happened in New York tells us a story, even in a country that has become fascist like the United States. It begs a question. So it's important for decision makers to really now understand what's interesting, the takeaways of the digital world. platforms using LLMs, large language models with AI, not to follow ChatGPT or to kindly ask ChatGPT to do this, that, or the other, considering AI to be a simple assistant, but having data as an entity, a school, a state, a ministry, taking your data, your documents, your media, textbooks, etc., based on which I'll use the digital AI world. They're called RAGs. You can group the strength of AI with databases, but that are specialized, dedicated databases. In my case, it would be media education, media literacy. Journalists have done it. It's the Spinoza project. I don't know if you've heard about it, but the idea is that the 10, 12 major media which grouped around Reporters Sans Frontières, another platform, to pool all their articles on the environment and climate, so that then, with AI, they can produce new articles on the environment and the climate, but trusting the source, trusting the data to produce new information in the media. So there are solutions, there are things to be done. And my problem, and I come back to David's important question, why doesn't it work? Well, I have to say it again. Decision makers simply don't have a clue as to what the digital world is. They weren't born into the system, weren't educated in the system, and they're interested in holding on to an old system because they understand it. They know how to work with it and around it, but that's very risky.
I think the only thing I want to add is to focus on, and you asked the question, Tom, about sort of what has changed since I was Special Rapporteur. And when I was Special Rapporteur, we made a pretty big effort to try to crack open the platforms for exactly these kinds of discussions with civil society and with others. And for a while that went fine. But that's not really in the cards right now. And part of that is, and these platforms are not necessarily unitary. This isn't to say that there aren't people inside the platforms who want these kinds of conversations. But at the most senior levels, they have thrown themselves in particular with the US government. And so I think the trend line right now, and this is certainly true, I actually don't think that the game for them is capturing social media. I mean, the game for them is having the freedom to develop AI tools, particularly LLMs, in order to have an unregulated space for these new tools. And so, whereas maybe 5 years ago, there was quite a bit of room for conversation with the platforms, to the extent they've become kind of married to, the US government, which is quite resistant to engagement from civil society. I think we face a real threat, which again goes back to the issue of, Europe has been in the lead on the regulatory side. Whether it's the DSA or the DMA, or it's the AI Act, or here the AI framework, which is really the only human rights-focused approach that's been adopted for AI regulation, that actually Europe now has a responsibility to ensure that they're standing for these regulations. And I don't think the move, again, there was a time when a lot of this could be in a kind of self-regulatory framework of conversation and so forth, and I think we're past that. We're in a place where the platforms just need to be reined in. and the US isn't going to do it. And the big question is, is Europe, and does Europe even have the power to do it?
And that's a great way to wrap up the discussion. And now we're going to open to questions. I'm going to look out at the floor. I'm going to take 3 questions initially. Please keep it short. Tell us who you are, and do keep it short and do have a question. I'm going to ask 140, 90, and 184.
Thank you very much. My name is Rami Nouati. I am from Benin Republic. I am part of the youth delegation for the Forum on Democracy. My question is going to be in French because I want to speak to the teacher of Sorbonne. Donc, merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much for your explanation. My question is, how can we help people to have access to education, to fact-checking? You talked about mechanisms for journalists, but what about those that the information is for? How can they know whether it's true or false?
Ask the panelists to respond, Davina. That's for you. And number 90.
No? Oh, okay. Okay, thank you so much. My name is Yana Brenzei, and I'm a journalist from Ukraine. I'm a journalist and a TV host. And I have seen first sight how media is working under real risk. During the first panel named 10 Facts, we looked at the data from the freedom of expression under threat map, and Ukraine was placed in the highly restricted category. But the context was ignored. Our context is war. And during the war, the usual rules isn't work. So my question is how the other countries and your medias are preparing for the war. Why I'm asking this? Because I'm sure that the democracy not is only at risk. Democracy is at war. Is it alarmism, you can say? So let's look at the facts, just few facts. Russian drones has violated the airspace of European countries from Norway to Romania. Russian fighter jets have entered Latvia and Estonia. In Poland, there has already been damage caused by Russian drones. At Christmas last year, a tanker from Russia's Shadow Fleet damaged an underwater power cable between Finland and Estonia. In Vilnius and Warsaw, shopping malls and malls were set on fire. A massive cyber attack, please give me a second, a massive cyber attack paralyzed airports in Berlin, Brussels, London, and other. This is cases of war on land, on fire, cyberspace, and other. We collected for this event on the website democracy@war.today for show you how many facts now we have. So we are fighting in this war like Ukrainians for 11 years. We know how to do it, and we really thank you for everyone who helped us. But together it's time to be joined and to stand together about this threat, because democracy is at war. Are you preparing for this?
And thank you very much for that. And just also to say that we stand in solidarity with the Ukrainian journalist community. I would perhaps direct that question, David, to the response and around Ukraine. Has it been enough? And, well, what has it taught us? And what do we need? How do we need to be responding to it? The last question, 184.
Is it there? Yes. Hi, sorry. My name's Nick Williams. I'm from Index and Censorship, and I'm also part of the Council of Europe platform for the protection of journalists. I've got a question for David about the sort of media concentration, but out with the platforms, but more looking towards conventional media outlets. This morning, it was reported that Blick, Hungary's largest tabloid, has been bought by a pro-government organization. Also, we've seen in the US, CBS and ABC being basically blackmailed for coverage with the threats of legal action, as well as consolidation in other countries like the UK, France, and a number of these other countries. And I think this is a real struggle for organizations to know how to address that aspect. It's very different to journalists being attacked at protests or slaps that we may have a certain sort of roadmap of addressing. I was in Budapest last week, and there's a lot of concern about how you join up the press freedom work with the competition work, both within the European framework. Hungary's suing the EU over EMFA, and we've not necessarily seen a roadmap to try to address this sort of consolidation. What would you see as what do organizations like Index, the Council of Europe platform, others do to respond to this sort of market capture, especially at a time of collapsing democratic norms, independent institutions? Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think what we're going to do is also see if we have other questions that the other two panelists could answer in relation to Asia, both Gayatri and Dr. Tanaka. Are there any questions regarding Asia? We have 61. And so 61.
Good afternoon. My name is Adna Mujic. I'm a legal intern and young European ambassador from Bosnia and Herzegovina. I have a question regarding freedom of expression. Namely, in Bosnia and Herzegovina, the recent criminalization of defamation has raised serious concern regarding freedom of expression. How can emerging democracies strike a balance between protecting reputation and safeguarding the essential role of a free press? Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I'm going to pass that question around protection of reputation while safeguarding the press to Dr. Tanaka and Gayatri. If we could answer those questions, and then we'll have time for another round.
To the person from Benin, thank you for your question. Now, fact-checking is a question that arises in Africa, in Asia as well. There are groups, well-established groups of fact-checkers in Africa. I'm thinking of Africa Check, with you have Africa Check Congo and other branches, Côte d'Ivoire, etc. So these are bodies, journalists that have been trained, sometimes with the help of Europe. There is a genuine cooperation that exists. The issues that arise in Africa in terms of elections are not the same, and the types of violence, the types of disinformation that exist, but there is great work that is being done, and there is education to the media. We have a network, French-speaking network called Reframe, that there are various organizations that educate to the media in French-speaking Africa, in Cameroon, in Côte d'Ivoire, and there is consultation. In the Francophonie, there is an online platform called ODIL, O-D-I-L. In it, you have a mapping of public policies that exist in Francophone countries, and there are many of them. And they take care of education to the media literacy, strategies, good practices, and there are many things about fact-checking. So we can use digital networks to be effective locally on the ground. You can use actual mechanisms and adjust them to local realities. So it's good news, I would say, for journalists and fact-checkers. And same exists in South America, which is not in the round table, but there too they've been organizing. There is Maldita, which is a fact-checking body that started in Europe, but it is present in Mexico, in Colombia, etc. And there are exchanges of good practices. That's how civil society can help civil society.
So I'll take, I think, two of the questions were directed towards me. Or at least one was directed towards me by you, even though it's, yeah, so I'm blaming you, Tom, for that. No, so I want to, first on the, I share the expression of solidarity with Ukraine, and I want to start with that, but also say that when we're talking about journalism in conflict situations, you know, particularly when you have two parties, it's very easy and wrong to draw equivalences, right? And the law of war, the law of armed conflict actually directs us towards that. But in the case of Ukraine, I think it is important for us to acknowledge at the very outset that there's an aggressor country here, Russia, and there's a victim country. And that's not to say that everything about Ukraine, the Ukrainian government's laws related to the press need to reflect that, but I think that has to be our starting point for understanding the nature of the conflict, which the question highlighted. And I think in thinking about that, we can also think about the way in which the Russian Federation has engaged in a really extraordinary crackdown on the media in Russia. You know, both in terms of criminalizing even the mere reporting on the military, to imprisoning people for dissent, just a whole range of things that Russia is doing that are clearly inconsistent with freedom of expression. But when we do think about, and I don't know the details of the study and how the study at least led to its characterization of the situation in Ukraine, but I do think it's important for us to look at and to separate, on the one hand, the extraordinary courage of Ukrainian journalists, separate that from looking at whether Ukrainian law and policy and law enforcement are enabling journalists to do their job. And it's to do their job in a very difficult circumstance. There's no question about that. But Ukraine is a democracy, and I think Ukraine wants to be judged by democratic norms. And again, this is high level, generic, but I think as we look at the situation, yes, we can take into account that we're talking about a situation of armed conflict, but at the same time, we need to be looking at, even in that context, is the government providing the space, the ability for journalists to publish their work, to be critical of government when it should be critical, to report from the front lines? Is it enabling that? And again, I don't know all the details, but that's what I would be looking at for us to effectively judge whether we think Ukraine is behaving, or at least the government is behaving appropriately in the context of armed conflict. I'm not sure that's a satisfying answer, but that's at a level of generality that I can muster. As far as media concentration, I think what I want to suggest is, again, it's going back to freedom of expression and the law around it. So a lot of press freedom advocacy, which is extraordinary, maybe directs people to think about protecting journalists, and so it's journalist focused. But when we're talking about, you know, consolidation in Hungary or consolidation in the United States or anywhere else, you know, we're not just talking about journalists, we're also talking about audiences. We're talking about individual access to information. And I think we need to be framing those conversations, not just in terms of what harm this does to the industry of journalism, but how this is a real direct assault on democratic institutions and democracy and democratic debate. And I don't think we often, I mean, maybe that's the complexity part, but we often don't get into that discussion. And I think there's a lot of room to do that. Even Index on Censorship does tremendous work. But even the name Index on Censorship gets us to be thinking about what the government is doing in order to silence voices. And concentrations are a little bit different. And I think that it requires us to think about the tools of antitrust, of competition policy, and how those can be used to counter essentially power, which is a little bit different.
Well, the really difficult thing is what to do and how to do with respect to the tendency of authoritarianism within democracies. And if the leader supported by the majority of the public try to suppress the press, try to silence the voices of oppositions, what can outsiders do? That's really a challenging thing. We could raise voices of concerns. I think probably we could do that. But then how effective could that be? Depends on circumstances. The political leader who may be popular mobilize nationalistic sentiments against the international criticisms. And so criticism may backfire and then strengthen the power of repression. That really poses questions, particularly to the responsible journalists around the world. But I think, this, what I'm going to say may not be the, immediate answer. But I believe the journalists or historians or political scientists could present the analysis of how authoritarianism silenced journalism and free press. There are many cases in the past how the independent journalism was silenced around the world. If you look at the history of many authoritarian countries, and then many authoritarian countries started with the democratic institutions, and then they elect a president, quite popular president, and then the popular president get re-elected several times, and then in the meantime they try to silence, utilizing, well, often they use lawsuits or sometimes they utilize the a taxation office to investigate their income records of the journalism, and those I think past experiences may be recorded by the responsible journalism, and then maybe shared by the many of those people who would like to seek liberty. And then this, well, may not realize immediate results, but in the long run, as a matter of material of education, I think this could be useful, particularly those of us who are living currently under liberal democracy, may be able to detect the signs of the coming authoritarianism by reading the past records of authoritarianization.
So I'll respond to the question about, I think the speaker has left, about how to balance, I think, or at least to address questions about reputation and freedom of expression. And I think this is the lesson from countries in transition. And I think this is, I'll try to also link to what David talked about, the focus on journalism, because this is a critique of international media development and critique of reforms processes that has the element of international development in that sense, where you have very specific focus, very tangible outcomes and outputs that ignore some of the intersections between economic issues and media issues or journalism issues and public issues. And so ignoring political economy of the media and saying, let's focus all our resources on building the journalists, as though the journalists are the ones who determine every single thing in the media landscape. They themselves are part of the system, right? Part of the structures. So I think the reason why countries like Bosnia, as she had raised. It's an experience in Indonesia. It's an experience that Myanmar had also in its transition, but abruptly halted. But things that we see in the region where when we've had media reforms or reforms, political reforms, there are selected areas that are focused on, looked in isolation, so in silos, rather than connected together. So one of the key things that activists in Indonesia have said is that the focus of media, the journalist reforms for press freedom ignored constitutional sort of statements regarding the broader protections for freedom of expression, which they're trying to fill in now 20 years later. But the situation is not conducive for that because new challenges have come along the way. And so you have that gaps because there were very specific areas that, you could say windows of opportunity, so you target that. Great reforms there, but then it is very much siloed. So how do you balance some of this interest? I think in the process of doing the sort of thinking around reforms, it is bringing all of the other aspects. Media capture is something that I'm surprised that we're talking about it as though it's something new. It's not. I mean, we've lived in an environment where the media has been largely seen that kind of connections between corporates and the political interests, but it's been ignored as an area of reform because it's difficult. It's about businesses, it's about investments. And I think that going forward, this has to be the main sort of framework looking at reforms, whether it's on media or freedom of expression. And just to also just to and then say that I think the it's again, look at transitioning societies. Let it be a warning for, I think, some of the others. Sorry.
Thank you. Alas, the clock is ticking, and we're going to have to end this session. And so before we do that, I'm going to turn to the panelists and give you 60, if I'm generous, 90 seconds to communicate a key element, message, or conclusion, a takeaway, if you will, for the audience to take with them as they leave the session. Something from the discussion, something really important that you think needs to be communicated now. Davina, would you like to kick us off? And I do want to stress brevity. Thank you.
Right. Not easy.
My concern goes for young people. And so I would say that they are the ones creating the new media of now. The models are Brut, that is a French media that was born under the Gilets jaunes and is now spreading with same models worldwide. So it's platformizing. TEDx, platformizing. Podcasts, including from traditional media, platformizing. Radio France, very good follow-up. So if we follow what young people are doing, we see how journalism gets itself reinvented and is doing it by models that are being taken over by young people in other places, developing their own business model that is under the radar of the big platform owners. That big platform owners are buying media or Wikipedias is a sign that these are thriving, important places of resistance that we should save and save with young people. So that's what I'm saying. Young people are going to be the future of democracy. Journalism, as they see it, is going to save the democracy and the information they want to save.
Plus one, 100%. I completely agree with that. And I think for me, the takeaway in a way is, at least for civil society organizations, to be thinking about, given the new media environment that we're in, and given the fact that civil society organizations for so long have had to rely on other people's channels, how do we develop our own channels? How do we develop our own access to the public? And I think it's a huge challenge, in part because of the rise of LLMs and AI and sort of this kind of ease of getting answers that we're going to have to be fighting. But I really take from sort of the youth of the future to, we also have to figure out what is the present path for actually having a voice in a pretty complex media environment.
So I would conclude with two. One, claim democracy, not reclaiming, we haven't fully lost it, claim it. So I'm very happy with this idea of the Democratic Pact, Democracy Pact. I think it's great, and that should be shared across as well. But I think just adding on also decolonizing the frameworks in which we are approaching a lot of these things about media, about ideologies. I think we do need to step back and just sort of break ourselves from some of the very, very colonial structures of thinking. So I will say that openly. And second, regional and global alliances are so important. And I think that one we should not give up. It has had its really positive impact. And I would say that we still need to pursue those as ways of bringing people together and also the shared norms. Thank you.
Well, I would like to emphasize the role of what may be regarded as the traditional media in reporting complex reality surrounding us. And there may not be easy and simple solutions. And there are diverse views amongst the people. I believe that traditional media make extra efforts to tell to the people that there are wide-ranging opinions. And given the tendency of social media network, people may be, particularly young people may be, boxed into a very extreme view, as those extreme views becoming the majority. And actually, I think the traditional media show the actual distribution of diverse opinions so that people can understand diversity.
I am afraid that we have to draw to a close because I think this discussion could go on. But I think some of the key messages is that there's a lot of work that we have to do together. If we were, the Secretary General mentioned this fast forward 10 years, if we were to all suddenly come back in 10 years' time, I hope the conversation would be about how we managed and are continuing to manage the problems of the past. The other alternative route of dysfunction, disinformation and instability just cannot be allowed. So we have to keep this dialogue alive. We have to really buzz with ideas and make these ideas translate into action. And we need to unite because we're against enormous and powerful threats and challenges. Thank you very much to the audience for listening. Enjoy your lunch. And thank you to the panelists as well. They've been great. Thank you. Have a good afternoon.
Thank you very much indeed. I have some important, thank you very much to our panelists and to Tom for having hosted. I have some important information about what's happening next. You might want to listen to what's happening. So we now conclude the first plenary session and the lunch break will go till 14 o'clock, that's 2 o'clock. For those of you not involved in any of the organized working lunches, you are welcome to follow the signs to the self-service cafeteria, which will be at your own expense. I'm sorry, we can't invite everybody. At 2 o'clock, this is really important, at 2 o'clock, we will gather in the lobby of the Hemicycle for the inauguration of not one, but 2 exhibitions. The first one will bring to your attention the works of Maltese artists with the title Fragile Foundations, an invitation to reflect on the great cycles of human existence. The second exhibition with the title The House Where Ukrainian Diplomacy Was Born, in cooperation with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Ukraine, will offer an immersive journey through the evolution of Ukrainian diplomacy. It's really important. We will return to this hemicycle by 2:30 when the plenary session number 2 with the title How Can Culture and Cultural Policy Strengthen Democracy is scheduled to begin. So as we say in France, bon appétit, but do go to those 2 exhibitions at 2 and see you here at 2:30. Thank you very much indeed.